tonight we descend into the dust of southern Iraq, where the earth is flat, pale, and wind-scoured, and where the ruins of the world's first cities sleep beneath low mounds of baked clay and broken brick, here, under a sky that can seem too large for human thought. Archaeologists once lifted from the soil the smallest of objects, little tablets hardened by fire, impressed with wedge-shaped marks, silent for thousands of years. They were not treasures in the ordinary sense. They were not golden masks, jewelled crowns, or bronze swords laid beside fallen kings. They were humbler than that. Clay, river mud, the kind of material a farmer might scrape from the bank of a canal. Yet within those tablets lived kings, floods, hymns, contracts, offerings, lamentations, and the names of gods who are said to have owned cities. This is where the mystery begins. For the ancient Sumerians, cities were not merely places where people gathered for protection, trade, and survival. Cities were sacred instruments. They were living houses for divine powers. Their temples rose not only as monuments of stone and mud brick, but as meeting points between earth and sky, between human hunger and immortal command. Eridu belonged to the deep god. Uruk belonged to the radiant goddess of love and war. Nippur belonged to the lord of wind and authority. Lagash, Kish, Shuruppak, each carried its own sacred personality, its own divine owner, its own place in the ordering of the universe. To modern eyes, this sounds like myth. To the ancient inhabitants of Mesopotamia, it was geography. The clay tablets tell us that the gods did not simply hover above the world, distant and abstract. They ate in their temples. They slept in sanctuaries. They received clothing, bread, beer, incense, song, and obedience. Their statues were washed, dressed, carried in procession, and guarded like royal bodies. Around them, whole economies moved. Fields were measured, herds were counted, workers were assigned, scribes recorded jars of oil, baskets of grain, and the delivery of animals for sacrifice. In this world, theology and administration were one breath. To serve the city was to serve the god. To serve the god was to keep creation itself from dissolving into chaos. And still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The ancient Sumerians did not leave us a single book explaining themselves in the language of modern historians. Instead, they left broken archives, scattered lines, damaged hymns, king lists, temple accounts, mythic poems, and fragments recovered through stratigraphic excavation from ruined layers of occupation. Their world must be reconstructed slowly, patiently, from tablets found in museums, from inscriptions copied long ago, from seal impressions, from pottery sequences, from radiocarbon dating, from lithic analysis, from the patterns of mud brick walls exposed beneath centuries of silt. It is a science of fragments, and those fragments are often strange. Some texts say kingship descended from heaven. Some describe cities that existed before the flood. Some speak of divine beings who established sacred spaces, measured foundations, and gave civilization its shape. Some remember a time when humankind was created to relieve the gods of labour. A colder, simpler explanation might say that all this was political language, a system invented by priests and rulers to control grain, labour, and belief. There is truth in that. Power does often dress itself in holiness, but such an explanation does not empty the mystery. It deepens it. Why did early cities need gods so intensely? Why did people build immense temples before palaces became the dominant symbols of rule? Why did the first great experiments in urban life seem to gather around the sacred rather than the purely practical? The old assumption was that agriculture created surplus. Surplus created cities. Cities created rulers, and rulers then created religion to justify their command. Yet the ancient Near East has never been obedient to easy stories. Again and again, discoveries disturb the neat staircase of progress. Religion may not have been a decoration placed upon civilization after it was already built. In many places, it may have been one of the engines that gathered people together in the first place. Ritual, memory, fear, obligation, feasting, sacrifice, and cosmic imagination may have drawn human beings into shared labour long before bureaucracy hardened the arrangement into law, the Sumerian city was not an accident of irrigation alone. It was a vision. Imagine the wide banks of the Euphrates in the dim light before dawn. Reeds hiss in the river wind. Cattle stir behind low fences. The smell of wet clay rises from canals. Somewhere, a temple platform catches the first line of morning, its walls coloured by sun, its summit lifted above the settlement like an artificial mountain in a land with no mountains. Below, men and women move through narrow lanes. Potters fire vessels. Weavers bend over wool. Fishermen sort nets slick with river water. A scribe presses a reed stylus into clay while a supervisor speaks quantities aloud. In the sanctuary, offerings are prepared for a god who cannot be seen by the ordinary eye, but whose presence is treated as more certain than the rising sun. To live in such a city was to inhabit a layered world. There was the visible city, with its houses, workshops, walls, drains, courtyards, animals, and crowded streets. There was the administrative city, recorded in numbers, seals, rations, taxes, and labour obligations. There was the political city, where assemblies, elders, rulers, and warrior elites argued over authority. But beneath and above all of these was the divine city, the city imagined as part of a cosmic design. Its true owner was not necessarily the king. Its true owner was the god. This idea shaped everything. A temple was not merely a place of worship. It was a household. It owned land. It employed workers. It stored grain. It sponsored craftsmen. It gave legitimacy to rulers. It received tribute. It organised festivals that turned streets into sacred theatre. Its central statue was not viewed as a symbol in the modern sense, but as a living focus of presence. The divine image could be fed, clothed, praised, and even taken captive in war. When enemies conquered a city, they did not only break walls, they might remove the god, and in doing so, they wounded the soul of the place. This is why the Sumerian texts matter. They do not simply tell us what people believed. They reveal how belief built institutions, how institutions built cities, and how cities taught human beings to imagine power on a scale never before seen. In the marks pressed into clay, we see not only myths of heaven, but the birth of organised time, recorded labour, measured land, sacred kingship, and memory that outlived the bodies of its makers. Yet one must approach these tablets with care. They are not transparent windows. They are more like moonlit water, reflective, shifting, beautiful, and dangerous to read too quickly. A hymn may preserve theology. A myth may encode political memory. A king list may combine history with sacred imagination. A flood story may carry echoes of real inundation, but also moral terror, ritual renewal, and the ancient fear that the world itself was never fully secure. The cities of the gods were therefore not secret because no one knew their names. Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, and were famous in their own time. Their secrecy lies elsewhere. It lies in the distance between their minds and ours. It lies in the fact that they built civilization upon assumptions we no longer share, yet cannot dismiss. They saw no firm wall between economics and worship, between architecture and cosmology, between political order and divine command. Their world asks us to imagine a civilization where every canal might be part of a sacred duty. Every ration tablet a trace of cosmic service, every city gate a threshold between the mortal and the eternal. And so, beneath the deserts and alluvial plains of Mesopotamia, beneath broken ziggurats and collapsed houses, beneath museum drawers and half-translated fragments, the old question still waits. Were these cities built for people who dreamed of gods? Or did the dream of gods build the cities? There is no final answer tonight. Only clay, darkness, and the patient work of those who read the dead signs. Only the scorched landscape where the first city dwellers raised their eyes to temple towers and believed that heaven had descended into brick. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made, what buried archives still remain unopened, what lost sanctuaries still lie sealed under the dust. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and tell us where you are listening from and what local time it is in your corner of the world. As we begin our slow journey into the secret cities of the ancient gods, the land of Sumer was made by water, but it never truly belonged to water alone. It lay in the southern plain of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers loosened their burdens of silt and spread them across a low, shimmering world. There were no great forests here, no long ridges of protective mountains, no quarries of fine stone waiting beside the settlement walls. The horizon was wide and exposed. The sun moved across it with merciless authority. In summer, the heat pressed down upon the reeds and canals until the air seemed to tremble. In winter and spring, floodwaters could break through banks, swallow fields, and change the shape of a village's future in a single day. To create a city here was an act of defiance. The rivers were generous, but they were never gentle. Unlike the Nile, whose yearly inundation followed a more predictable rhythm, the rivers of Mesopotamia could be difficult, violent, uncertain. They rose from distant lands, fed by snows and rains beyond the control of the farmers who depended on them. A canal dug in one generation might become choked with silt in the next. A field made fertile by irrigation might slowly gather salt until the crops weakened and the soil turned against its owners. The very system that made abundance possible carried the seed of exhaustion within it, and yet, out of this unstable plain came the first great cities. This is one of the central marvels of Sumer. Civilization did not rise in a soft garden where life asked little of human beings. It rose in a restless environment that demanded cooperation, calculation, memory, labour, and faith. The landscape itself trained people to think beyond the household. No single family could easily manage the larger canals, embankments, storage systems, and seasonal obligations required to survive at scale. Water had to be directed, fields had to be allotted, labour had to be summoned, disputes had to be judged, grain had to be measured and preserved. The river plain forced society to become organised, but organisation alone does not explain the strange grandeur of early Sumer. One can build ditches without imagining heaven, one can count barley without raising temple towers. The mystery lies in the way practical necessity and sacred imagination became inseparable. The canal was not only an engineering work, it was part of a moral and cosmic order. The field was not only a source of food, it was land under divine ownership. The storehouse was not merely a granary, it was a chamber in the household of a god. The environment shaped the gods themselves. In a place where river levels meant life or ruin, the deep waters became sacred. In a world where storms could flatten crops, divine anger could be heard in thunder. In a land without mountains, people built platforms that imitated mountains, raising temples above the plain so that the gods might descend to a height prepared for them. In a landscape of mud and reeds, humanity learned to make permanence from impermanence, pressing wet clay into bricks, drying them under the sun, stacking them into walls, shrines, terraces, and cities. The materials were humble, but the ambition was immense. Mud brick is not like granite. It decays. It slumps. It must be repaired and renewed. A temple of mud brick is always partly dying, always needing the labour of the living. This gave Sumerian architecture a rhythm of rebuilding. Sacred places were raised, restored, levelled, and raised again. One shrine might stand upon the buried remains of another. One platform might grow taller over centuries as successive generations rebuilt on the same consecrated ground. Stratigraphic excavation reveals these stacked lives of buildings, layer upon layer, like memory made physical. In such places, the city became a mound before it became a ruin. From a distance, one might see a low swelling above the plain, a tell formed by centuries of occupation. Beneath that mound lay houses, courtyards, ovens, graves, drains, storage rooms, tablets, ceilings, and temple foundations. The people who lived there did not think of themselves as fragments in an archaeological sequence. They were bakers, priests, farmers, brewers, mothers, shepherds, merchants, scribes, and children. Their days were filled with heat, dust, smell, sound, hunger, laughter. Obligation and prayer. At dawn, the river mist might cling low over the canals. Reed boats moved in narrow channels, their cargoes heavy with fish, dates, clay jars, wool, and cut reeds. Donkeys brayed near the edges of the settlement. Dogs barked among the lanes. The smell of cooking barley rose from small houses. In the temple precinct, workers prepared offerings from the produce of fields that stretched outward beyond the city's walls. There was noise everywhere, but not chaos. The rhythm of work had order, and much of that order flowed toward the sacred centre. The Sumerian world was also a world of exchange. Because southern Mesopotamia lacked many raw materials, its cities had to reach outward. Timber, stone, metals, and precious goods came from distant regions through trade, diplomacy, migration, and sometimes war. Lapis lazuli from far mountains, copper from distant sources, hardwood from lands beyond the alluvial plain, shell from the Gulf, and stone vessels from places where stone was not a fantasy. These objects moved through networks that tied the cities of Sumer to a wider ancient world. The river plain, though flat and local in appearances, was never intellectually small. Every imported object carried distance within it. A bead could speak of mountains. A copper tool could speak of miners and merchants. A carved seal could carry images of animals never seen by many who handled it. Material culture reveals not only what people used, but what they desired, feared, valued, and imagined. Lithic analysis can identify the origins and techniques of stone tools. Ceramic studies can trace habits of production and exchange. Botanical remains can show what people ate and cultivated. Genomic data, when preserved and carefully interpreted, can help illuminate movement, ancestry, and contact across populations. The cities were therefore not isolated miracles. They were knots in a widening web. Still, the plain itself remained the heart of the story. The rivers gave the people their fields and their danger. Floods could erase boundaries, and boundaries mattered intensely in a world of irrigation. A line between fields might decide food, wealth, duty, and survival. The earliest administrative texts are full of measured things: grain, labour, animals, beer, oil, wool. This habit of recording did not emerge from idle curiosity. It arose because organised life required memory beyond the human voice. Clay became the mind of the institution. Writing began, in part, because cities needed to remember, but memory was never only economic. The same civilization that counted sheep also composed hymns to gods. The same scribal world that marked rations also preserved stories of creation, flood, kingship, and the ordering of heaven. This combination is what makes Sumer feel so hauntingly modern and so utterly distant. Its people were practical and visionary at once. They knew how many workers were needed for a task. They also believed that the success of the task depended upon invisible powers. The rivers made this double vision inevitable. Nothing in Sumer was fully secure. Not harvests, not canals, not dynasties, not even cities. A watercourse could shift. A ruler could fall. A god statue could be taken. A field could turn white with salt. The world had to be maintained, and maintenance was both labour and ritual. Civilization was not a state achieved once and kept forever. It was a daily negotiation with mud, water, heat, hunger, authority, and the divine. This is why the earlier cities of Sumer feel less like finished inventions than living bargains. They were bargains with rivers, bargains with soil, bargains with neighbours, bargains with gods. The people stood on a plain that offered no certainty, and from that uncertainty they built walls, temples, archives, and stories that would echo for millennia. Out of reeds and clay they made a world where humans could gather by the thousands, where time could be written, where power could be named, where the heavens could be imagined as an order mirrored on earth. And somewhere in the evening, as the light dimmed over the canals and the temple top glowed with the last red of the sun, one might have understood why the Sumerians gave their cities to gods. No mortal hand alone could ever have seemed enough. The voices of Sumer did not return all at once. They came back slowly, as if rising from a sealed room deep beneath the earth, where the air had not moved for thousands of years. At first there were only strange signs on clay. marks like small wedges, strokes, hooks, and impressions pressed by a reed into damp mud. To the untrained eye they seemed decorative, perhaps magical, perhaps meaningless. They did not resemble the flowing alphabets of later ages. They looked more like bird tracks crossing a riverbank, or rain striking soft earth and freezing there forever. Yet those marks were speech. The rediscovery of Mesopotamia was not only a triumph of excavation, it was a triumph of patience. A buried city can be uncovered with spades, baskets, notebooks, and labourers under a burning sun. A buried language requires something more elusive. It requires comparison, doubt, memory, discipline, and the willingness to spend years staring at signs that refuse to speak. Before the clay tablets could become history, someone had to learn how to listen. The first great breakthrough came through cuneiform writing in general, especially through royal inscriptions written in more than one language. Scholars working on the inscriptions of ancient Persia began to realize that the wedge-shaped script could represent known names, royal titles, and repeated phrases. Once Old Persian cuneiform yielded its structure, other scripts written in similar signs slowly came into view. Akkadian, the Semitic language of Assyria and Babylonia, began to be read. Then, deeper behind Akkadian, older and stranger, stood Sumerian. Sumerian was not like Akkadian. It did not belong to the same language family. Its grammar moved differently. Its words carried an ancient isolation. It seemed to stand alone, like a black stone in the middle of a plain. Even after scholars could read many Akkadian texts, Sumerian remained more difficult, more remote, and more ghostly. It survived partly because later scribes preserved it as a learned and sacred language, copying hymns, lexical lists, myths, and school exercises long after everyday speech had changed. In this way, Sumerian became both a living memory and an intellectual relic. The scribes themselves became the first guides. Ancient students had copied word lists. They set Sumerian terms beside Akkadian equivalents. They practiced signs, repeated phrases, memorized proverbs, and learned the old language through drills that sometimes feel astonishingly human. On some tablets, mistakes can still be seen: a crooked sign, a correction, a clumsy exercise pressed by a young hand. These school tablets are among the most intimate artifacts of the ancient world, because they show not kings in triumph, but learners struggling with difficulty, just as learners have always done. Through these ancient classrooms, modern scholars entered the mind of Sumer. Museums filled with tablets became libraries of a civilization once thought lost. Shelves and drawers held administrative accounts, letters, hymns, myths, legal records, mathematical exercises, and royal inscriptions. Some tablets were whole. Many were broken. Some were burned hard by ancient destruction, preserved by the very fires that ended the buildings around them. Others were soft, damaged, salt-eaten or fragmentary, bearing only a handful of signs. The work of reading them became an act of reconstruction, not unlike placing scattered bones into the outline of an unknown creature. A single tablet might change everything. One fragment could preserve the name of a ruler otherwise almost invisible. Another might identify a temple, a canal, a goddess, a city quarter, a legal custom, or an offering ritual. A small administrative receipt could reveal the scale of a workforce. A hymn could show how a city imagined itself. A myth could preserve a memory of divine authority older than the king who copied it. Each text was modest in appearance, but immense in implication. The decipherers had to become more than translators. They had to be historians, linguists, archaeologists, and detectives of damaged clay. They compared signs across tablets. They traced how symbols changed over centuries. They studied scribal conventions, phonetic values, determinatives, grammar, and the shifting relationship between spoken words and written marks. Cuneiform was not a simple alphabet. A single sign could sometimes carry a word value, a sound value, or a clue to meaning. Context was everything. A sign pressed in one tablet might behave differently in another. The script was a system of memory, but memory with many doors. This made certainty difficult. Even today, some readings remain debated, Some words are obscure, some divine names may conceal older meanings, some passages are damaged just where the answer seems closest. The ancient tablets often tempt the imagination, but they also punish haste. A responsible reading must move slowly, respecting grammar, context, and archaeological setting. The line between revelation and fantasy can be thin. The tablets speak, but they do not shout. They murmur through breaks, gaps, conventions, and silences. Still, what they revealed was astonishing. They showed that the cities of Sumer were not mute heaps of ruin. They were places full of named people, counted goods, legal disputes, temple songs, royal ambitions, and cosmic speculation. They showed that the Sumerians possessed a deep intellectual culture, capable of abstraction, poetry, classification, mathematical thought, theology, and historical memory. These people were not primitive figures stumbling at the dawn of civilization. They were subtle, organized, ambitious, anxious, imaginative, and often painfully familiar. They loved order. They feared disorder. They praised gods. They argued over property. They remembered floods. They glorified kings. They mourned destroyed cities. They trained children to write. They wondered why the world had been arranged as it was. The recovered texts also reshaped the very idea of history. For centuries, many ancient Near Eastern cities were known largely through later traditions or through the ruins themselves. The clay tablets gave them interior life. They allowed Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, Eridu, and to speak in their own categories, even if not always in ways we easily understand. The cities were not merely settlements, they were institutions with divine identities, ritual calendars, economic systems, and memories of sacred origin. The translation of Sumerian texts changed the dead landscape into a populated world. A mound became a city, a broken platform became a temple, a seal became an act of authority, a ration list became the trace of hungry workers, a hymn became the sound of a procession moving through streets thick with incense, drums, and expectation. One of the most haunting things about these texts is their ordinary physicality. Great myths were not written on clouds. They were written on clay tablets small enough to fit in a hand. Cosmic stories lived on mud. The descent of kingship from heaven, the founding of sacred cities, the anger of gods, the destruction by flood, the laments for ruined temples, all of it depended on a fragile object made from river earth. And yet clay endured where palaces vanished. It survived when voices died, when roofs fell, when fields changed course, when gods lost their worshippers. The scribes could not have known the full weight of what they were preserving. A temple administrator recording Bali may not have imagined that. Thousands of years later, someone in a distant country would study his numbers to understand the structure of labour. A student copying old vocabulary may not have known that his exercise would help resurrect a language. A priest composing a hymn may not have known that his praise would become evidence in a long argument over the birth of cities, kingship, and sacred power. This is the quiet miracle of decipherment. It does not merely translate words, it restores distance. It allows the ancient world to remain ancient, not flattened into modern expectation, not reduced to fable, not dismissed as childish superstition. The translators opened a gate, but what waited beyond that gate was not simple. It was a civilization that believed the universe was ordered through divine command, yet recorded that order with astonishing administrative precision. It was a world of incense and inventory, of myth and mathematics, of prayer and paperwork. Even now, many tablets remain unread or only partly studied. Some sit in collections, catalogued but not fully interpreted. Some exist as fragments separated from their original companions. Some may still lie beneath the earth, sealed in collapsed rooms where shelves once held the memory of temples and courts. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The work continues, slow and exacting, under museum lights, in excavation reports, in digital archives, and in the careful minds of those who know that one sign can alter an entire sentence, and one sentence can alter an entire age. The first translators did not simply recover a language. They awakened a civilization of cities, gods, workers, kings, scribes, and dreamers. They gave sound to the wedge marks. They proved that the clay was not dead, And from those small tablets, darkened by time, the ancient gods began once more to receive names. There was a time in the deep memory of Mesopotamia when the city had not yet fully become the possession of kings. Its walls, if walls existed at all, were not yet symbols of imperial pride. Its streets had not yet been carved into the ambitions of dynasties. Its people had not yet learned to see history mainly through the triumphs of named rulers, carved in stone or pressed into clay. In that older atmosphere, more difficult to grasp and easier to misunderstand, the sacred centre seems to rise first. Before the palace dominates the imagination, the temple stands. This is one of the most powerful clues left by early Sumer. The first cities were not only larger villages, they were ceremonial organisms, places where labour, memory, food, authority, and awe converged around sacred precincts. Their inhabitants may have farmed, traded, fished, herded, brewed, baked, built, and argued as human beings always have. Yet at the centre of the settlement stood something that reached beyond survival. A raised platform, a shrine, a courtyard, a place where offerings gathered and where the invisible owner of the city was treated as present, demanding and alive. To understand this, imagine entering an early southern Mesopotamian settlement not as a conqueror, not as a tourist, but as a person whose life depends upon water, grain, and favour. The ground underfoot is packed mud. Reed mats hang in doorways. Smoke rises from low ovens. Children move through narrow spaces between walls. The air smells of animals, bitumen, fish, date syrup, warm clay, and damp canal edges. Beyond the houses, fields stretch outward in green strips divided by irrigation channels. Above the settlement, higher than the roofs, stands the sacred building. It is not tall by the standards of later empires, but in that flat land height itself is a message. The temple platform changes the horizon. It says that this place is not random. It says that people have chosen a centre, that labour has been gathered, that memory has been fixed. It says that an invisible presence has been given an address. In a landscape where river channels shift and mud brick decays, the repeated rebuilding of a shrine is an argument against disappearance. Each generation raises its sacred place again, not merely because the building is useful, but because identity depends upon it. In time, these sacred centres became associated with cities whose names still carry a strange force. Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, Kish, Shuruppak. Each was more than a dot on a map. Each held its own divine relationship, its own local history, its own rivalries, its own claims about order and origin. The Sumerian world was not a single kingdom in the beginning. It was a constellation of city-states, each bright with its own god, temple, fields, canals, and political life. Their shared culture bound them together, but their loyalties could be fiercely local. One city might praise its deity as supreme, another might claim ancient precedents, a third might become wealthy through trade, conquest, or control of fertile land. This urban pattern is vital. Sumer did not begin as a centralized nation in the modern sense. It was a world of competing sacred cities. Each city possessed its own agricultural hinterland, its own temples, its own elites, its own assemblies or councils in earlier periods, and later its own kings. The city was the unit of meaning. It was the human community, the divine household, the economic engine, and the political theatre all at once. Before kingship hardened into royal spectacle, authority may have been more distributed, more fluid, more negotiated. Archaeology cannot recover every voice from the assembly, every dispute beside a canal, every elder's judgment, every priestly command. Still, the material record suggests a long development from communal and temple-centered organization toward more formalized rulership. Monumental art and inscriptions eventually bring rulers into focus, but the temple system has deeper roots. Sacred architecture appears again and again as an organizing principle. The palace is loud in history because kings love to announce themselves. The temple is older in silence. This does not mean early Sumer was peaceful or equal in any simple way. Labour had to be commanded. Surplus had to be collected. Specialists had to be supported. Some households were richer than others. Some people controlled access to land, stores, ritual knowledge, and decision-making. Inequality was already forming its long shadow across the alluvial plain. Yet the language of power was not initially just the language of kings. It was the language of service to the gods. A ruler in such a world could not merely say, "This city is mine." He had to say, in effect, "I serve the god who owns this city." This distinction matters. It shaped political imagination for millennia. The divine city did not erase ambition. It sanctified it, constrained it, disguised it, and magnified it. A leader who repaired a temple could present himself as a pious servant. A leader who dug a canal could claim to restore divine order. A leader who defeated an enemy could say the city's god had triumphed. Political action became sacred action when performed in the name of the divine household. The earlier city, then, was not merely a population centre. It was a stage on which humans acted out their dependence on powers greater than themselves. In Uruk, the scale became astonishing. The city grew into one of the largest urban centres of its age, with monumental precincts, craft production, administrative technologies, and the earliest writing systems. Yet even here, at the heart of urban complexity, religious architecture remained central. Great buildings rose in planned spaces, offerings were organised, seals marked authority. Workers and goods moved through institutions that were at once economic and sacred. Uruk was not simply busy, it was choreographed. In Nippur, the sacred authority of the city took another form. It was not always the strongest military power, yet it held extraordinary religious importance because of its association with the great god of authority and command. Kings from other cities sought legitimacy there. To be recognized in relation to Nippur was to stand inside a broader sacred order. This reveals a remarkable political idea. A city could wield power not through armies alone, but through holiness, reputation, ritual precedence, and control over sacred tradition. Eridu offered a still deeper memory. Later tradition imagined it as one of the oldest cities, a primeval place associated with wisdom, deep waters, and beginnings. Its archaeological layers show long sequences of temple rebuilding, modest at first, then increasingly formal. This is the kind of evidence that unsettles simple models. People returned to the sacred spot again and again. They rebuilt. They maintained continuity. The city's significance was not a sudden invention. It accumulated. Layer by layer, like silt in a canal, like memory in clay, these places show that cities before kings were already rich in meaning. They required coordination, they generated specialization, they gathered surplus, they produced symbols, they made people think in scales larger than family or clan. A temple needed builders, suppliers, ritual experts, administrators, singers, cooks, herders, brewers, and guards. Around the divine household, a complex society could form. It did not need a crown at the beginning to become powerful. It needed a centre that many people accepted as necessary. The sacred centre also created time. Festivals divided the year. Offerings marked days. Agricultural cycles were woven into ritual calendars. The rising river, the sowing of grain, the shearing of sheep, the brewing of beer, the preparation of feasts. All could be drawn into a rhythm supervised by temple institutions. People did not merely live through seasons. They enacted them. They gave them songs, processions, meals, obligations, and stories. A city became a machine for remembering what must be done, but memory is never innocent. Those who control sacred memory can shape society. Priests, administrators, and scribes stood close to the divine centre, and proximity to the god could become proximity to wealth. Stores of grain, herds, land, and offerings required management. Management created records. Records created power. Power created hierarchy. Thus the temple, while sacred, was also a place where social differences could deepen. The gods may have owned the city, but human beings decided who carried the grain and who counted it. This tension gives early Sumer its drama. A city built for a god also housed tired workers. A temple hymn praising divine abundance stood beside ration lists that measured human labour. Sacred festivals may have inspired awe and belonging, yet the construction of monumental buildings required bodies, schedules, discipline, and perhaps coercion. The beauty of the divine city was never separate from the sweat of the mortal population. Every raised platform was also a record of hands. There, in that tension, Sumer becomes most real. Not a fantasy land of gods walking openly through streets, and not a cold administrative machine stripped of wonder. It was both at once. It was mud, brick, and incense. It was barley dust and sacred song. It was canal labour and cosmic order. It was a society learning how to become urban by placing the god at the centre, then slowly discovering that whoever managed the god's house might also manage the lives of people. The cities before kings did not lack power. They invented forms of power so ancient that later kings inherited them rather than created them. They showed that the first urban revolution was not only a matter of food production, population pressure, or trade. It was also a revolution of imagination. Human beings began to live inside institutions larger than themselves, institutions that claimed divine origin, divine ownership, and divine purpose. And so the low mounds of Sumer, quiet beneath the desert light, are not merely ruins of ancient settlements. They are the remains of a world in which the city was born as a sacred experiment, a place where the human crowd gathered not simply to survive, but to serve, a place where earth was measured, water was governed, labour was recorded, and heaven was given walls. Eridu rises in the imagination like a city remembered from the first morning of the world. Not a city of marble, not a city of tall stone gates or shining bronze towers, but a city of mud, brick, reed, water, smoke, and silence. It stood in the far south of Mesopotamia, near the old marshlands, where earth and water seemed to mingle without clear boundary. There the land could appear half-formed, as though creation had not yet finished its work. Pools reflected the sky, reeds whispered in the wind, birds crossed the pale air in slow lines. Fish moved beneath brown water. The horizon shimmered with heat, and beyond the settlement the wet world opened into mystery. To later Sumerian memory, Eridu was not simply old, it was first, in ancient tradition, it was named among the cities that existed before the Great Flood, a place where kingship descended from heaven, a place chosen by divine power when human civilization was still young. Whether the texts preserve literal history, sacred memory, political theology, or some deep mixture of all three, Eridu holds a special position. It is the city of beginnings, the place where the divine and the urban seem to meet in their earliest surviving form, the place where the house of the deep god stood above the alluvial plain, rebuilt again and again as generations returned to the same sacred ground. Archaeology gives this memory a physical weight. At Eridu, excavators uncovered a remarkable sequence of temples, one built over another, each layer resting on the remains of an earlier shrine. The earliest faces were modest, almost humble. Small rooms, simple plans, mud brick walls, offerings placed in relation to sacred space. Yet over time the buildings grew larger, more formal, more monumental. The sacred place did not disappear. It intensified. The repeated rebuilding suggests continuity, devotion, and a persistent belief that this exact location mattered. This is one of the most haunting patterns in the ancient world. People did not merely build a shrine, abandon it, and forget. They returned. They repaired. They expanded. They buried the old beneath the new, not to erase it, but to stand upon it. Each new temple rose from the memory of the last. Each generation inherited a sacred centre, already deep with authority. The result was not only architecture, it was time made vertical. Stratigraphic excavation reveals devotion as a stack of floors, walls, ash, pottery, foundation deposits, and collapsed brick. Eridu's god was associated with wisdom, fresh water, creation, and the mysterious deep beneath the earth. In a land where irrigation meant life, this was no minor thing. Beneath the visible world of fields and canals, people imagined a hidden source of fertility and knowledge. Water did not simply fall from the sky or flow across the surface. It emerged from unseen depths. Springs, marshes, rivers, and underground waters could all be folded into a sacred imagination in which the deep was not empty darkness, but a realm of power. The god of Eridu belonged to that realm. He was not a storm raging across the horizon. He was a quieter, older presence, connected to craft, intelligence, order, and the sweet waters that made life possible. This gives Eridu a different mood from later cities of conquest. Its power feels primeval rather than imperial. It is not first remembered as the place of great armies or vast royal ambition. It is remembered as a holy beginning, a city rooted in the waters under creation. Its importance lies in wisdom, in ritual precedence, in the memory of order established at the dawn of settled life. To enter Eridu in imagination is to enter a world where civilization does not yet announce itself with the harsh voice of empire. It speaks through the temple, the marsh, the canal, the offering bowl, the carefully laid brick. The landscape itself must have shaped this sanctity. The southern Mesopotamian marshes were rich, shifting, and strange. They offered fish, birds, reeds, water plants, and routes of movement. They also concealed danger and uncertainty. A marsh is never fixed like a mountain. Channels open and close, water levels change, islands of dry ground appear and vanish, sound carries oddly across reeds, mist can obscure distance. In such a place, the boundary between seen and unseen feels fragile. It is easy to understand why the earliest sacred imagination might have found depth there. The city was built from what the land allowed. Reed and clay, bitumen and woven matting, bricks dried by sun, materials taken from the immediate world, shaped by human hands, and offered back in the form of sacred architecture. There is a quiet poetry in this. The people of Eridu did not need distant stone to create holiness. They took mud from the ground and made a house for a god. They took fragile substances and created continuity. The temple survived not because mud brick was eternal, but because people kept renewing it. This kind of permanence depends upon devotion. A stone monument may endure through neglect. A mud brick temple survives through care. Its walls require maintenance. Its surfaces need repair. Rain, wind, salt, and time gnaw at it constantly. Every rebuilding is an act of resistance against decay. Every new layer says that the place still matters. At Eridu, the long sequence of sacred construction suggests that generations accepted this burden. The god's house had to stand. The city's identity depended upon it, yet Eridu was never merely a symbol. People lived there. They cooked, traded, worked, buried their dead, argued, loved, mourned, and carried water. The sacred city was also a human settlement full of ordinary needs. Its holiness did not remove hunger. Its divine owner did not bake the bread with invisible hands. The god's house required human labour, and human labour required food, tools, organisation, and discipline. Around the temple gathered a social world in which offerings and administration began to intertwine. A sacred building can begin as a focus of reverence. Over time, it can become an institution. That transformation is one of the hidden revolutions of early civilization. A shrine receives gifts. Gifts require storage. Storage requires accounting. Accounting requires trusted specialists. Specialists require training. Training creates authority. Authority gathers more resources. Soon the temple is not only the place where people meet the divine, it is the place where grain, animals, labour, and memory are organised. The holy house becomes a centre of social gravity. Eridu allows us to watch this possibility in its earliest shadows. The archaeological layers do not speak in full sentences. They do not tell us exactly what was sung in the first shrine, who supervised the offerings, who cut the reeds, who shaped the bricks, or who decided that the next temple should be larger than the last. But the sequence itself is eloquent. It shows attention, it shows return, it shows the growth of sacred form. It suggests that before the city became a machine of monarchy, it may already have been a vessel of ritual power. Radiocarbon dating, ceramic sequences, and careful excavation place Eridu among the ancient foundations of southern Mesopotamian urban development. Yet the scientific language does not destroy the mystery. It sharpens it. The more precisely we place Eridu in time, the more extraordinary its endurance becomes. The more carefully we separate building phases, the more we see the persistence of sacred choice. The more we examine the material culture, the more we recognize that the earlier city was not crude or thoughtless. It was experimental, adaptive, and deeply meaningful. This is where the old myths and the soil begin to speak to each other. The texts remember Eridu as a city of firstness, a city before catastrophe, a city tied to divine wisdom and the deep. The archaeology reveals an ancient sacred centre rebuilt across long spans of time. These are not the same kind of evidence. They must not be forced into a simple answer. Myth is not excavation. Excavation is not myth. Yet they face one another across the ages like two lamps in a dark room. Between them lies a question that remains answerless, a drift to ponder. Why did this place matter so much? Perhaps because water mattered. Perhaps because memory gathered there. Perhaps because an early community found in that marshland a point of contact with powers it could not name in ordinary language. Perhaps because the temple offered a way to stabilize an unstable world. Perhaps because every human settlement needs more than walls and food. It needs a story telling its people why they are there. Eridu gave its people such a story. It told them that beneath the world lay wisdom. It told them that the city was not accidental. It told them that human labour could participate in divine order. It told them that mud brick walls, carefully raised in the heat, could become the dwelling place of a power older than kings. It told them that civilization began not only with tools and fields, but with reverence. And now Eridu's quiet. Its god no longer receives bread in the old sanctuary. Its canals have shifted. Its houses are ruin. Its temple platforms have slumped into the mound. The voices that once filled its sacred spaces have fallen into the silence of the plain. Yet the city remains one of the great clues to the ancient human condition. It reminds us that the first cities were not born only from hunger, fear, or ambition. They were also born from wonder. Somewhere in the ruined layers of Eridu lies the memory of people standing before a shrine in a young world, believing that the deep waters had spoken and that heaven had chosen a place on earth. Uruk was the city where scale became destiny, across the southern plain, where canals cut through the flat earth and fields opened beneath the white glare of the sun. Uruk rose into a form of human life the world had scarcely seen before. It was not merely a settlement enlarged by population. It was an event in the long history of the species, a place where the village mind was forced to stretch into an urban mind, a place where labour, ritual, craft, trade, administration, and myth gathered until they became something almost terrifying in its ambition. To walk through Uruk in imagination is to feel the pressure of numbers. Thousands of people moving through streets and courtyards, workers carrying baskets of clay, potters shaping vessels by the hundreds, weavers producing textiles from wool, brewers preparing beer in large quantities, farmers bringing grain from the surrounding land, herdsmen delivering animals to temple estates, scribes marking tablets with signs that began as pictures, counts, and tokens of accountability, then slowly opened into one of humanity's great inventions. Writing was not born as a poem, but it became capable of poetry. It began in the world of measures and goods, but it would come to hold kings, gods, grief, desire, and the memory of cities lost to time. Uruk was a furnace. In that furnace, old forms melted and new forms appeared. A person living in a smaller village might know the faces, fields, obligations, and stories of nearly everyone nearby. In Uruk, life demanded abstraction. People had to trust seals, tallies, officials, storehouses, schedules, and institutions. Goods moved beyond the memory of a single household. Labour was divided into specialised tasks. Authority needed marks. Identity needed symbols. Ownership needed proof. The city created complexity, and complexity created writing. The reed stylus became one of the quiet instruments of revolution. Pressed into damp clay, it allowed memory to leave the body. It allowed an institution to outlive the voice of the person who spoke an order. A flock could be counted. A ration could be assigned. A field could be measured. A worker could be recorded. A delivery could be verified. The city began to think through clay. not in the way a human mind thinks, with breath and fear and imagination, but through archives, repetitions, signs, and stored obligations. Uruk taught humanity that power could be written down. At the heart of this world stood sacred architecture. The great precincts of Uruk were not incidental decorations. They were engines of concentration. They drew materials, labour, and attention towards spaces set apart from ordinary domestic life. Temples and platforms rose above surrounding streets as visible declarations that the city was bound to divine presence. Their walls were shaped, decorated, renewed, and approached through planned movement. Ritual was not hidden in the margins. It occupied the centre of urban order. The goddess associated with Uruk was no gentle abstraction. She embodied love, war, desire, power, splendour, and dangerous beauty. Her presence gave the city a radiance both fertile and violent. In her sphere, the energies of life were not separated into tidy categories: attraction and conflict, abundance and destruction. Sovereignty and longing belonged together. A city devoted to such a goddess could imagine itself as charged with supernatural intensity. Uruk was not only productive, it was dazzling. It demanded to be seen. Its buildings reflected that desire. In the sacred areas, archaeologists have uncovered traces of monumental construction that required planning on a vast scale. Walls, platforms, niched facades, mosaics of coloured cones pressed into surfaces, great halls, and carefully organised spaces suggest a society capable of mobilising labour and imagination in equal measure. These were not accidental accumulations of mud brick. They were statements. They shaped how people moved, where they looked, what they felt, and how they understood their place beneath the gods. Architecture taught obedience through awe. A person approaching a great temple platform would have felt height in a land that had little natural height. The building itself created a mountain where the plain had none. Its mass changed the body's experience of space. One had to look upward. One had to move through controlled approaches. One entered an order designed by others, maintained by others, sanctified by tradition. The city did not simply contain sacred power. It staged it. Yet the grandeur of Uruk rested upon countless ordinary acts. A monumental building begins with hands in mud. Someone digs clay. Someone mixes it with straw. Someone shapes bricks in moulds. Someone carries them. Someone sets them in rows. Someone hauls reeds, water, bitumen, timber, and plaster. Someone prepares food for workers. Someone records the rations. Someone supervises the teams. The magnificent surface of the city hides exhaustion beneath it. Every high wall contains the ache of shoulders. Every sacred platform contains the rhythm of feet crossing the same ground again and again. This is why Uruk must be seen as both miracle and machine. It created beauty, order, and cultural invention, but it also demanded coordination at a scale that could become oppressive. The city brought people into proximity, but proximity requires control. It offered protection and identity, but identity can harden into hierarchy. It allowed craft specialists to develop extraordinary skills, but specialization ties human lives to institutions that feed and command them. It created written memory, but written memory can serve those who hold the tablet and the seal. In Uruk, the seal became another instrument of urban life. Cylinder seals, carved with images of animals, figures, rituals, and scenes of authority, could be rolled across wet clay to leave a continuous impression. They were practical and beautiful at once. A sealed jar, door, bundle, or tablet carried proof that someone with recognized authority had acted. The seal impression was a signature, a symbol, a miniature world of images, and a guard against disorder. In the crowded life of the city, where goods moved through many hands, trust needed a visible skin, the images on these seals open a small window into the urban imagination. Animals in ordered rows, heroic figures mastering beasts, processions, offerings, temple scenes, hybrid beings from the edges of myth. These images suggest that the people of Uruk saw power not only as an administrative fact, but as a cosmic struggle. Nature had to be ordered, wildness had to be grasped, fertility had to be secured, the divine had to be honoured. Human authority appeared as the ability to mediate between abundance and danger. The city stood between the marsh and the sky. Around it lay fields fed by canals. Beyond the cultivated zones lay reed beds, steppe lands, trade routes, and unknown distances. From outside came materials the alluvial plain could not provide: stone, metal, timber, and luxury goods arrived through networks that extended far beyond the city's immediate horizon. Uruk did not merely receive the world, it reached toward it. Its influence spread through objects, styles, administrative habits, and perhaps colonies or enclaves connected to exchange. The city became a centre whose shadow stretched outward. But Uruk's greatest export may have been an idea. The idea that human beings could gather in enormous numbers around institutions that were more durable than families. The idea that a city could organise time, labour, belief, and goods under a sacred and administrative order. The idea that marks on clay could stabilise memory. The idea that a built environment could transform social life. The idea that divine power could be housed, fed, praised, and made central to urban identity. This idea did not remain simple. As Uruk grew, the relationship between temple and political authority became increasingly complex. Great households required managers. Managers could become elites. Ritual specialists could control access to the gods. Administrators could control grain. Those who controlled surplus could command workers. Those who commanded workers could build more impressive monuments. Those monuments could then justify further authority. Power fed architecture, and architecture fed power. The city became self-amplifying. More people allowed greater works. Greater works attracted greater prestige. Greater prestige demanded greater organisation. Greater organisation required more records, more seals, more managers, more labour. The sacred centre became a heart that drew resources inward and pumped authority outward. Uruk's streets may have echoed with the sounds of commerce and domestic life, but beneath that movement lay a deeper rhythm, the pulse of institutions learning how to endure. Still, Uruk was not merely a structure of control, it was also a place of imagination. The later traditions of Mesopotamia would remember Uruk as the city of a legendary king, a figure of strength, restlessness, sorrow, and the search for meaning. Whether legend preserves memory or transforms it beyond recognition, the association is fitting. Uruk feels like the kind of place that would produce stories too large for ordinary life. A city of walls, gods, desire, and ambition would naturally dream in heroic proportions. The walls themselves became symbols of human achievement. A wall is practical. It defends, marks, and encloses. But a great city wall is also psychological. It tells those inside that they belong to a larger body. It tells those outside that this place has a boundary, a name, and a will to survive. It separates ordered space from the uncertain world beyond. In myth and memory, the wall of Uruk became a sign of civilization itself. Human labour made visible on a scale worthy of wonder, and yet every wall contains a warning. What must be protected can also be threatened. What rises can fall. What is famous can become ruin. The mud-brick towers of Uruk required maintenance, and no institution can maintain itself forever without strain. Flood, drought, shifting trade, political rivalry, and internal tension could all touch the life of the city. But in its great age, Uruk burned brightly. It showed what urban civilization could become when sacred ambition and administrative genius met on the river plain. At evening, the city would have changed its voice. The heat softened. Shadows lengthened across courtyards and walls. Animals were brought in. Workers returned with dust on their bodies. Fires lit in houses. The last light touched the temple heights, making the upper walls glow above the settlement. Somewhere a scribe smoothed a tablet. Somewhere offerings were prepared. Somewhere a mother called a child indoors. Somewhere a priest entered a chamber whose darkness smelled of oil, incense, and old brick. Uruk was not a modern city. It was stranger, nearer to the first astonishment of collective life. Its people were still discovering what it meant to live by the thousands within a shared institutional world. They were inventing habits that would shape empires, kingdoms, states, and cities for all the ages that followed. They were learning that humanity could build a second nature out of walls, records, rituals, and command. The city should have been impossible, not because people lacked intelligence, for they were our equals in fear, cunning, devotion, and ambition. It should have been impossible because it demanded so much from a landscape of mud and water. It required trust among strangers, obedience to invisible systems, repeated labour across generations, and belief strong enough to turn clay into heaven's dwelling. But Uruk existed, and from its furnace came writing, monumental urbanism, sacred administration, and a new vision of what human beings could make together when gathered beneath the gaze of gods. Nippur was the city of sacred authority. It did not need to be the richest port, the largest marketplace, or the most aggressive military power to shape the destiny of Sumer. Its strength was of another kind. It stood as a holy centre, a place where kings came not merely to boast, but to be recognised, blessed, and woven into the order of the gods, in a world of competing cities, where rulers rose and fell like dust devils over the plain. Nippur carried the weight of divine approval. Its god was the lord of command, air, storm, breath, and power. His presence was not soft. He was not imagined as a local spirit of a single field or a kindly guardian of one household. He was a force of order and authority, the kind of god whose favour could make kingship seem legitimate, and whose anger could make the world tremble. His city became a hinge between heaven and politics, between the sacred invisible and the practical necessities of rule. To understand Nippur, one must imagine a city whose importance was not always measured in walls or armies, but in reverence. Pilgrims, priests, scribes, rulers, labourers, and envoys would have approached its sacred precinct with a seriousness unlike ordinary travel. The roads and waterways leading toward the city carried more than goods. They carried petitions, offerings, messages, vows, ambitions, and fear. A ruler might dominate neighbouring lands, but domination alone did not make him secure. He needed the language of divine order. He needed the gods to appear on his side. He needed Nippur. In such a world, holiness could become a form of power more durable than conquest. Armies can be defeated, grain stores can be emptied, palace dynasties can be erased. But a sacred reputation, once accepted across generations, can survive political storms. Nippur's authority lay in the belief that it belonged to a cosmic hierarchy beyond ordinary city rivalry. Its temples did not merely serve a local community. They helped define what rightful power meant across the Sumerian world. This is why rulers repaired temples there, made offerings there, and placed inscriptions there. To honour Nippur was to present oneself as a servant of the highest order. A king who rebuilt a sacred structure could claim piety. A king who dedicated gifts could claim divine favour. A king whose name appeared in connection with the city entered a realm of legitimacy that brute strength could not easily provide. The holy city converted political ambition into sacred duty. The temple complex stood at the heart of this drama. A temple in Nippur was not only an architectural mass, it was a theatre of divine kingship, a storehouse of tradition, an archive of obligations, and a centre of ritual movement. Its courtyards, walls, chambers, and platforms shaped human behaviour. People entered, waited, carried offerings, recited words, heard commands, and watched ceremonies whose meaning reached beyond the visible action. Ritual made authority felt in the body. It taught people where to stand, when to speak, when to bow, when to remain silent. The city's sacred spaces were also administrative spaces, where gods received offerings, people kept accounts, where incense rose, tablets accumulated, where songs praised divine command, scribes recorded the movement of barley, animals, oil, textiles, and workers. This union of the holy and the bureaucratic is one of the great signatures of ancient Mesopotamia. It reminds us that religion was not confined to inner emotion. It was public, economic, legal, architectural, and political. The divine household required management, and management created records. Those records gave Nippur another kind of immortality. Clay tablets preserve the rhythm of a world that would otherwise vanish into abstraction. They show that sacred authority was sustained not only by hymns, but by logistics. Bread had to be baked, beer had to be brewed, animals had to be brought, cloth had to be prepared, doors had to be sealed, fields had to be measured, workers had to be fed. A god's greatness on earth depended upon human systems of supply. This does not make the faith less real, it makes it more human. People do not build sacred cities with belief alone. They build them with mud brick, grain, sweat, skill, and memory. The awe of Nippur rested upon countless practical acts. Somewhere a worker carried water, somewhere a woman ground grain, somewhere a scribe sharpened the end of a reed, somewhere an official checked a seal impression, somewhere priests prepared the god's meal with a seriousness that turned food into cosmic service. The sensory world of Nippur must have been dense with meaning. At dawn, the light would have struck the upper temple surfaces, warming the colour of sun-dried brick. Dust lifted beneath feet in the streets. Donkeys moved under loads. The air smelled of clay, smoke, animal dung, oil, wool, and cooked grain. In the sacred precinct Ziusudra, the atmosphere shifted. There would be controlled movement, guarded thresholds, polished vessels, woven textiles, and the murmuring of ritual language. Sacred sound mattered. Hymns were not decoration. They were actions in words, ways of maintaining the relation between God and city. The scribes of Nippur lived near the heart of this memory. The city became one of the great centres of learning in Mesopotamian tradition. School texts, lexical lists, hymns, myths, and scholarly materials show the deep connection between sacred authority and scribal culture. To write was not merely to record, it was to participate in the preservation of order. The scribe stood at a threshold between speech and permanence, between fleeting command and durable clay. In Nippur, that craft carried exceptional prestige. A school tablet can seem small, almost comic, when compared to a temple platform, but it is no less important. On such tablets, students copied signs and words, learning the discipline that allowed an entire civilization to remember itself. Their work linked generations. A master corrected, a student repeated, a word list preserved old meanings. A hymn carried ancient theology into a new age. A myth survived because someone copied it in a room whose roof has long since fallen. Knowledge, like kingship, needed a sacred home. Nippur's role as an axis of religious learning meant that it helped preserve the deep grammar of Sumerian civilization, even when spoken language changed, even when political power shifted. Scribal tradition could keep older forms alive. The city became a reservoir of cultural memory. It guarded stories, divine names, ritual formulas, and learned classifications. Through this preservation, it shaped not only its own era, but later Mesopotamian thought. Yet one must not imagine Nippur as untouched by struggle. Holiness does not remove politics. It attracts politics. A city that can legitimize kings will inevitably become desirable to kings. Rulers wish to control it, honor it, use it, and be seen within its sacred orbit. The holy city stood inside the pressures of rivalry, conquest, restoration, and patronage. Its temples may have proclaimed divine order, but the human world around them was restless. Power entered the sanctuary not as a stranger, but as a supplicant wearing expensive robes. This tension made Nippur profound. It was a place where kings bent the knee and strengthened their authority by doing so. It was a place where divine humility and political ambition could appear in the same gesture. A ruler who claimed to serve the god might also be using the god's city to magnify his own name. A temple restoration could be an act of devotion, propaganda, gratitude, fear, or all of these together. Ancient motives rarely come to us clean and separate. They arrive mixed, like river water after flood. The sacred city therefore reveals one of the oldest truths about civilization. Power seeks heaven. It seeks a source beyond itself, something older, higher, and less vulnerable than armies or wealth. The ruler wants his command to feel natural, ordained, unavoidable. The temple provides this language. It says that order is not invented by men, but reflected from the divine. It says that obedience is not merely submission to force, but participation in a cosmic arrangement. It says that the city is not only a human construction, but an earthly point in a sacred map. Nippur stood at the centre of that map. Its holiness gave shape to a political universe where no king could be complete without divine recognition. Its scribes preserved the words that made order thinkable. Its temples turned offerings into legitimacy. Its god embodied command itself, the breath that moves between sky and earth, unseen but powerful enough to bend the world. And still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not hear the private doubts of the priests. We do not know what every labourer felt when carrying offerings to a god whose temple owned so much. We do not know how ordinary families spoke of Nippur at night, by lamplight, when official hymns were far away. We possess tablets, walls, seals, foundations, and damaged lines. From them we reconstruct a city of reverence, but the inner weather of its people often escapes us. That silence is part of its majesty. Nippur does not shout like a battlefield. It endures like a command spoken in a sealed room. It reminds us that some cities rule by trade, some by weapons, some by walls, and some by the invisible weight of belief, on the flat Mesopotamian plain, where kings came seeking the approval of powers they could not fully control. Nippur stood as the axis of heaven, a holy centre where authority passed through the hands of gods before it could rest upon the heads of men. The Sumerians did not imagine their cities as accidents. A city was not simply a cluster of houses beside a canal, nor merely a practical answer to hunger, trade, and defence. In the sacred imagination of Mesopotamia, the city had a deeper origin. It was planned in heaven before it was raised in clay. It belonged to a god before it belonged to its inhabitants. Its temples, walls, storehouses, and ceremonial spaces were not only human constructions, but earthly reflections of a divine design. This idea gives Sumer its strange and enduring power. In the ancient texts, gods are not distant ornaments placed above an already completed world. They are architects of order. They assign destinies. They establish sacred offices. They choose cities. They set boundaries. They command building. They inhabit temples as living presences. They transform raw land into meaningful territory. The world becomes civilized when divine intention is given form through human labour. The city, then, is a collaboration between heaven and mud. The gods may decree, but mortals carry baskets. The gods may choose a site, but mortals cut reeds, mix clay, mould bricks, lift beams, haul water, and smooth plaster. The gods may own the temple, but mortals repair its walls when wind and salt eat into them. This is one of the great tensions at the heart of Sumerian civilization. The city is sacred, yet it is made by sweating bodies. Its origin is divine, yet its survival depends upon human endurance. To build was therefore a holy act. A foundation was not merely technical, it could be ritual. The placing of a wall was not only architecture, it could be obedience. The raising of a temple platform did not simply create height, it created a meeting place between regions of existence. In a land where natural mountains were absent, builders made artificial heights, lifting sanctuaries above the plain, as though to shorten the distance between mortal streets and the upper world. The temple was the centre of this cosmic architecture. Its Sumerian name could be understood as a house. That word matters. A temple was not only a gathering place for worshippers, it was the dwelling of a god. It had rooms, possessions, meals, furniture, attendants, clothing, and rituals of care. The god's statue was treated with the solemn attention given to a living lord. It was washed, it was dressed, it received food and drink, it was protected from impurity, it was approached through regulated gestures, songs, offerings, and silence. This is difficult for the modern mind to enter. A statue today may be considered symbolic, artistic, or commemorative. For the ancient Mesopotamian worshipper, the divine image was something more charged and dangerous. It was not merely a reminder of the god. It was a point where presence could dwell. To harm it was sacrilege. To capture it was to wound a city. To restore it was to restore the relationship between heaven and earth. The divine image made the invisible politically and physically real. This is why city and god were inseparable. A city without its god was not merely conquered, it was spiritually dislocated. Its protection had failed. Its cosmic alignment was broken. Laments for destroyed cities speak with an emotional intensity that goes beyond military defeat. They mourn empty sanctuaries, abandoned streets, shattered rituals, and gods who have departed. The true horror is not only that buildings fall, it is that the divine household becomes silent. The Sumerians believed that order had to be maintained. Creation was not a completed event safely locked in the past. It required renewal, offerings, festivals, songs, temple repairs, purification rites, and correct administration all helped maintain the fragile arrangement of the world. Chaos was never far away. Flood, drought, famine, disease, invasion, and social unrest could all be interpreted within a universe where divine favour and human responsibility were closely linked. The city was a device for keeping chaos at a distance. Its walls marked an ordered interior, its temples anchored the divine presence, its canals controlled water, its archives controlled memory, its rituals controlled time, its rulers controlled conflict, or tried to. Every part of urban life could be understood as part of a larger struggle to hold the world in shape. The Sumerian city was not simply inhabited, it was maintained, almost like a fire that would die if not constantly fed. The gods, in this sense, were city builders because cities made divine order visible. A god's power could be known through a splendid temple, a full storehouse, fertile fields, successful festivals, loyal workers, and victory over rival cities. The magnificence of the god's house reflected the god's glory, but also the competence of the human community serving that god. A neglected temple was more than poor maintenance. It could signal disorder, impiety, or failing authority. The ruler's role grew from this sacred logic. He was not only a war leader or administrator, he was a builder for the gods. In inscriptions, rulers often present themselves as those who restore temples, dig canals, provide offerings, and carry out commands received through divine will. The image is carefully shaped. The king stands between the god and the city, receiving legitimacy from above and directing labour below. His power is justified by service, even when service also strengthens domination. This language is subtle and powerful. A ruler who says, "I built this temple for the god," is also saying, "I had the authority to gather the labour, command the resources, and inscribe my name into sacred memory." The act appears humble and magnificent at once. He is servant and master, tool and ruler, chosen worker and commanding lord. Sumerian political theology allowed such contradictions to live together because power itself was understood as something received, not merely seized. The divine city also shaped ideas of measurement. To build sacred architecture, one must measure space. To assign fields, one must measure land. To distribute offerings, one must measure grain, oil, beer, wool, and animals. The gods of the city lived within a world of exact quantities. This union of sacred order and practical calculation helped produce a culture of astonishing administrative precision. The divine plan did not float above numbers, it entered numbers. It entered tablets, seals, lists, and ledgers. There is a deep beauty in this. The same civilization that imagined gods setting the destinies of cities also developed systems for recording rations and deliveries. The same hands that pressed signs for barley might also copy a hymn. The sacred and the practical were not enemies. They were braided together. In the Sumerian city, a storage jar, a field boundary, a temple hymn, and a royal inscription could all belong to the same moral universe. This braided world challenges modern assumptions. Many modern people separate religion, politics, economics, and architecture into different categories. The Sumerians did not live by those divisions. Their cities were total environments of meaning. A canal could be an engineering work, an economic necessity, a political achievement, and a sacred duty at the same time. A temple could be a sanctuary, a warehouse, an employer, a school, a bank of memory, and a symbol of cosmic order. A ruler could be a military commander, a pious servant, a builder, a judge, and an instrument of divine command. This complexity is the true secret of the ancient god cities. Not that gods literally walked in ways that archaeology can prove or disprove. Not that every myth can be converted into a historical report. The secret is that the Sumerians built cities from an imagination in which the divine was structurally real. Their gods shaped law, labour, landscape, memory, and time. Whether one believes in those gods or not is not the historian's first task. The first task is to understand that the people who built Sumer lived as though the divine order was the deepest foundation of reality, and from that foundation came astonishing endurance. A sacred plan could outlive a ruler. A temple name could outlive a dynasty. A city's divine identity could persist through destruction, rebuilding, conquest, and political change. When new rulers arrived, they did not always erase the old gods. Often they honoured them, restored their temples, and used their authority. The divine city was older than the human claimants who fought over it. Its sacred reputation could absorb conquerors, forcing them to speak the language of the place they wished to rule. The gods built cities, and cities built gods in memory. This does not mean the gods were invented in a trivial sense. It means that divine identity was sustained through architecture, ritual, text, and repeated human action. A god known through a city became more visible as the city grew. A temple enriched by offerings magnified the god's presence. A hymn copied by scribes preserved the god's greatness. A procession through streets taught each generation where power lived. The divine was made durable through culture. The result was a world in which geography became theology. To say Uruk was not simply to name a place. It was to summon a goddess, walls, stories, rites, and an urban destiny. To say Nippur was to invoke command and legitimacy. To say Eridu was to remember the deep waters and beginnings. The map of Sumer was a map of divine relationships. Each city was a sacred personality. Each had a face turned toward heaven. This helps explain why Sumerian texts often feel both grand and strangely intimate. They speak of gods setting cosmic decrees, yet they also describe meals, clothing, beds, journeys, quarrels, laments, and households. The divine world mirrors the city, while the city mirrors the divine world. Heaven is imagined through earthly institutions, and earthly institutions are sanctified through heavenly stories. The two realms gaze into each other until the boundary grows thin. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made in the broken archives and buried precincts of southern Mesopotamia. New tablets may sharpen old readings. New excavations may expose forgotten shrines. New scientific methods may reveal patterns of diet, movement, climate, and craft that deepen the picture. Yet even with all our instruments, the ancient imagination remains partly hidden. The gods leave no bones. Presence cannot be excavated like pottery, but the cities remain. Their mounds stand as the residue of a radical human idea, that society could be built as a dwelling for powers greater than humankind. In the scorched plains, where clay cracked under the sun, and rivers carried both life and danger, people raised sacred houses and called them the centres of the world. They gave heaven an address. They gave gods a city. And in doing so, they gave civilization one of its oldest and most enduring dreams. The sacred cities of Sumer did not keep themselves alive by prayer alone. Behind every temple hymn, behind every procession of polished vessels and perfumed smoke, behind every carved seal and carefully copied tablet, there was labour, human labour, the bending back, the lifted basket, the hand darkened by clay, the foot sore from walking between field and storehouse, the eye trained to count sheep, jars, measures, bundles, days. The gods may have owned the great houses, but mortals filled them with bread. This is where the splendour of Sumer becomes most earthly. A temple was a divine household, but a household requires management. It required land to produce grain, flocks to provide wool and meat, orchards to offer dates and fruit, workshops to make vessels and textiles, kitchens to prepare food, storerooms to preserve goods, and officials to supervise the constant movement of materials. The god's house was a sacred centre, but it was also one of the great economic engines of the ancient city. The priests stood close to mystery, but they also stood close to supply. They knew the calendar of offerings. They knew which foods were prepared for divine meals. They knew the rituals of washing, clothing, and presenting the god's image. They guarded restricted spaces where ordinary people could not freely enter. They spoke words that had to be spoken correctly. They preserved gestures that had to be performed in the right order. Ritual precision mattered because the divine world was not casual. It demanded discipline. Yet the priest was never alone. Around the temple moved a wide population of workers and specialists. Bakers prepared bread in quantities shaped by ritual need and institutional scale. Brewers transformed grain into beer, not only for ordinary consumption, but for offerings and rations. Weavers worked wool into cloth, some of it destined for temple use, some of it moving through systems of distribution and exchange. Shepherds guarded animals belonging to divine estates. Farmers cultivated lands whose produce entered sacred storehouses. Potters made jars and bowls. Carpenters shaped wood brought from distant regions. Metalworkers handled precious and practical materials. Musicians gave sound to worship. Lamentation singers gave voice to grief when cities suffered or gods were believed to depart. The temple was a world within the city. It gathered all these people into a single rhythm, not always gently, not always equally, but powerfully. A great institution needs coordination, and coordination creates ranks. Some people commanded, some recorded, some inspected, some obeyed, some received larger shares, some received enough to survive. The ration tablet, so plain at first glance, can become one of the most revealing documents in history. It shows that sacred abundance was measured through human inequality. A worker might receive barley oil, wool, or beer as payment or ration. The amounts could vary according to status, gender, age, occupation, or institutional category. Behind every number there is a body. Behind every body there is a day of hunger or strength. These tablets do not often give us personal sorrow. They rarely pause to tell us whether a woman was tired, whether a child was afraid, whether an old worker's hands shook. But the numbers are not cold if we read them carefully. They are traces of lives consumed by the needs of gods, cities, and elites. The scribe stood between speech and control. He was not merely a clerk in the modern sense. He was a trained keeper of institutional memory. His skill required years of discipline. He learned signs, numbers, lists, formulas, and conventions. He pressed a reed stylus into clay with controlled movements, turning spoken instructions into durable record. In a world where most people could not write, the scribe possessed an extraordinary power. He could make obligation visible. He could preserve debt. He could identify workers. He could confirm delivery. He could bind an event to memory. Writing made institutions harder to escape. A promise spoken in a courtyard might fade, but a tablet could remain. A sealed document could accuse the forgetful or the dishonest. A record could move through offices, archives, and generations. The written sign carried authority because it appeared impersonal. It seemed to outlast argument. In this sense, scribes helped create a new kind of reality, a reality in which power could be stored in clay. The scribal schools of Sumer and later Mesopotamia reveal the long making of this power. Students copied lists of words, signs, professions, animals, stones, plants, cities, and gods. They practiced proverbs. They learned standard compositions. They trained their hands until writing became second nature. The process was repetitive, difficult, and likely severe, yet it produced minds capable of navigating a world of remarkable complexity. To be a scribe was to belong to a tradition that reached beyond one lifetime. A student copying an old hymn did not merely learn language. He entered a chain of memory. The sacred and administrative worlds met in the archive. Imagine a storage room within a temple complex, its shelves or baskets holding tablets of different shapes and sizes. Some are small and dense with numbers. Some record deliveries. Some carry seal impressions. Some list personnel. Some preserve hymns, rituals, or learned materials. Dust gathers. Clay dries. A tablet once soft becomes hard enough to survive the death of the hand that made it. Such rooms were not glamorous, but they were essential. They were the nervous system of the institution. In the streets outside, most people lived by rhythms older than writing. They rose with light. They worked according to season, weather, command, and need. They knew the smell of wet earth after canal water reached a field. They knew the bitterness of dust in the mouth during dry wind. They knew the weight of grain sacks. They knew the sound of animals penned near houses. They knew festivals when the city changed its mood and the gods were carried into public attention. They may not have read the tablets that recorded their labour, but those tablets helped define their lives. Sacred labour could create belonging, to take part in temple service, to provide offerings, to join a festival procession, to hear hymns in the public spaces of the city. All these things could bind people into a shared identity. The temple gave the city a heart. It provided beauty, drama, rhythm, and meaning. It made people feel that their work belonged to something larger than themselves. This should not be dismissed. Human beings do not live by grain alone. They seek order, story, and participation, but sacred labour could also become burden. The same institution that gave meaning could demand service. The same storehouse that fed workers could control them. The same scribal record that preserved order could preserve obligation. The same temple that glittered with divine presence could cast long shadows over those whose names were reduced to numbers. Sumerian civilization was not innocent. No civilization is. Its monuments were built by organized work, and organized work always raises the question of command. Still, the ancient people were not passive figures trapped inside systems they could not understand. They were intelligent, strategic, observant, and deeply human. Workers negotiated where they could. Families sought advantage. Officials protected status. Scribes cultivated skill. Priests guarded knowledge. Rulers courted divine favour. The city was a living contest of interest held together by custom, belief, force, and necessity. Its sacred language did not erase human ambition. It gave ambition a ritual form. The priests and scribes were therefore not simply servants of the gods. They were builders of social reality. They translated divine ownership into daily administration. They turned cosmic order into schedules, lists, offerings, and commands. They made the gods' household function across time. Without them, the divine city would have remained an idea. With them, it became a system. There is something haunting in this union of reverence and record-keeping. A hymn might describe the temple as radiant, beloved, and filled with divine splendour. A tablet from the same institutional world might list exact quantities of barley issued to workers. One text lifts the mind toward heaven. The other brings it back to the storeroom floor. Together they reveal the truth of Sumer more fully than either could alone. Civilization was made from both song and accounting. At dusk, when the day's heat began to weaken, a scribe may have set aside a finished tablet to dry. Nearby, workers returned from fields and workshops. Priests prepared rites in chambers scented with oil and smoke. Animals shifted in pens. Bread cooled. Beer settled in jars. The temple stood above the movement of the city, not silent, but filled with countless small sounds of maintenance. The gods were fed because people laboured. The city endured because people remembered. And the tablets survived because someone, long ago, pressed a reed into clay and trusted that the mark mattered. Water was the oldest blessing of Sumer and the oldest terror. It came through the rivers, through the canals, through the marshes, through the hidden dampness beneath the soil. It carried fish, reeds, silt, fertility, movement, and life. It made the grain rise. It cooled the mouths of animals. It allowed boats to glide where feet would sink. It gave the cities their fields and their food. Without water, southern Mesopotamia would have been a harsher emptiness, a plain of heat, dust, salt, and thirst. But water also destroyed. The same river that nourished a field could tear through it. The same canal that carried life could overflow its banks and drown the labour of a season. A flood did not arrive as an idea. It arrived as sound, pressure, mud, broken walls, floating wood, terrified animals, and bodies trying to climb above the brown rush. It lifted grain jars, collapsed houses, erased boundary lines, poisoned wells, and left behind a skin of silt over the familiar world. In a land built from mud brick, water was not only dangerous, it was intimate with ruin. This is why flood memory became so powerful in Mesopotamian thought. The Sumerian texts preserve traditions of a great flood, a catastrophe so immense that it divided time itself. Cities existed, kings ruled, then the waters came, afterward and kingship had to descend again. Whether these stories preserve distant memories of real regional floods, ritual images of destruction and renewal, theological reflections on human fragility, or a woven fabric of all these things, their emotional force is unmistakable. Flood was not merely weather, flood was judgment, reset, terror and beginning. The ancient people of the river plain lived under the knowledge that the world could be undone. A field was never just a field. It was a temporary victory over water and salt. A canal was never just a channel. It was a line of negotiation with forces that did not care for human plans. A city wall was not simply defense against enemies. It was also a barrier against the collapse of order. The labor of civilization had to be repeated because nature did not sign treaties. The Sumerians knew this not abstractly, but through experience. Rain falling far away could swell a river near home. A breached embankment could summon every able body to emergency work. Silt could choke channels. Standing water could spread disease. Marsh edges could advance or retreat. A change in the river course could turn a prosperous district into a stranded memory. People who depended on irrigation understood that abundance was never permanent. It had to be managed, guarded, repaired, and richly secured. This environmental uncertainty shaped the deep imagination of the cities. The gods were not only radiant patron, they could be withdrawn, angered, distant, or devastating. A ruined city might be explained not only through military defeat, but through divine abandonment. A failed harvest was not only an agricultural problem, it was a sign demanding interpretation. The world was readable, but not always clearly. People searched the behavior of rivers, stars, dreams, omens, animals, and disasters for messages from powers beyond ordinary sight. Flood stories gave form to this anxiety. They said that civilization could be swept away. They said that even kingship, even temples, even the great cities of gods might not be secure. They placed human achievement beneath a darker horizon. The Sumerians were builders, but they were not naive builders. Their myths did not imagine civilization as invincible. They imagined it as fragile, granted, threatened, and dependent upon cosmic mercy. The memory of flood also carried a strange paradox. Water destroys, then makes life possible again. After flood waters withdraw, the land may be coated in new silt. The surface is changed, but not always dead. Seeds may grow in the renewed earth. Boundaries must be redrawn. Houses must be rebuilt. Graves must be remembered. A flood is catastrophe, but it can also become a beginning in the mind of those who survive. This is why stories of flood often contain both grief and renewal. They are not simply endings. They are wounds from which new orders emerge. The ruined foundations of Sumer speak this language of a loss and rebuilding. Archaeologists encounter flood deposits in some Mesopotamian sites. Layers of water laid silt between phases of occupation. These layers are not one universal event covering every city at the same time. Despite the temptation of dramatic simplification, they are local, complex, and difficult to interpret. A silt layer may represent a flood, but the meaning of that flood in human memory is another question. Science can identify sediment. It cannot directly measure fear. That distance matters. Radiocarbon dating can place organic materials in time. Stratigraphic excavation can show that one layer came before another. Soil analysis can reveal episodes of inundation, abandonment, or environmental change. Yet the human experience of disaster must be approached through architecture, repair, burial, text, and imagination. A flood layer is a physical fact. A flood myth is a cultural response. They may touch each other, but they are not identical. The Sumerian flood tradition becomes profound because it lives in that space between earth and story. It remembers water not only as an event, but as a possibility always waiting. It transforms the instability of the river plain into a sacred drama. It asks why the gods would permit destruction. It asks how life can continue after the ordered world has been drowned. It asks what survives when houses, fields, and cities vanish under brown water. The answer, again and again, is memory. A survivor remembers, A scribe writes, a city rebuilds, a ritual is performed. A king claims renewed legitimacy. A temple rises again on older debris. The world after disaster does not simply resume. It must be narrated back into order. People need to know not only what happened, but what it means. The flood story gives catastrophe a shape that can be carried by later generations. This does not make the story comfortable. In the ancient imagination, the flood is overwhelming precisely because it suggests that human beings live by permission. Civilization is not a possession secured forever. It is a gift, a task, and a risk. The gods may grant the arts of settled life, but they may also revoke protection. The river may feed the people, but it may also carry them away. Such a worldview is not primitive fear. It is an honest confrontation with uncertainty. Modern life often hides dependence behind technology. Ancient Sumer could not hide it. The river was visible. The canal was visible. The field's thirst was visible. The salting of soil was visible. The collapse of mud brick after heavy water was visible. Environmental limits pressed against the city every day. The people of Sumer developed systems of irrigation, administration, storage, and ritual because the world demanded constant attention. Neglect could become famine. Disorder could become death. Soil exhaustion was another slow disaster. Irrigation in hot climates can bring dissolved salts toward the surface. Over time, if drainage is poor, the land can lose fertility. Crops that once thrived may weaken. Farmers may shift from one grain to another more tolerant of salt. The change is not as dramatic as a flood rushing through a street, but it may be more relentless. It is the disaster of white crust on soil, poor harvests, shrinking yields, and anxiety moving through households year after year. The Sumerians lived not only with sudden danger, but with slow pressure. Their cities required immense systems of food supply. Population concentration increased demand. Temples and palaces consumed resources. Armies, workers, specialists, priests, and administrators all depended on the productive countryside. When fields suffered, the city felt it. When canals failed, the gods' houses still required offerings. Environmental stress could therefore become social stress, political stress, and theological stress. The earth beneath civilization was never passive. It answered back. In flood memory and ruined foundations, we find a civilization aware of its own precariousness. This awareness did not stop the people from building. It may have made them build with greater urgency. They raised platforms above the plain. They rebuilt sanctuaries on old ruins. They stored grain. They kept records. They prayed. They watched the river. They repaired canals. They told stories in which a world could end and still begin again. There is a deep human truth here. Every civilization lives beside waters it cannot fully command. For Sumer, those waters were literal. They glittered under the sun, filled the canals, softened the clay, fed the barley, carried boats, and haunted the dreams of scribes. The cities of the gods were born from water, and water remained their most intimate threat. The people built order from mud, knowing that mud remembers every touch of rain and flood. At night, after the heat of the day, one might have heard frogs in the marshes and the low movement of water against reed banks. The city lamps flickered. The temple stood above the dark streets. Somewhere, a family slept in a house whose walls had to be repaired after every season of wear. Somewhere, an old story of the flood was spoken again, not as entertainment alone, but as warning. The world can be drowned. The world can be rebuilt. And between those truths, Sumer made its cities. Kingship in Sumer did not rise like a clean blade from the earth. It gathered slowly, unevenly, through ritual, crisis, ambition, warfare, memory, and the hardening of institutions. The sacred cities had long known authority. They had known temple households, elders, assemblies, administrators, priests, and scribes. They had known the discipline of canals, the command of labour, the counting of grain, and the storing of surplus. Yet there came a time when the figure of the king stepped more visibly into the centre of the world. standing between the people and the gods with a force that would reshape history. The king was not merely a strong man with soldiers. He was presented as chosen, favoured, summoned, or appointed by powers beyond the human crowd. His rule needed more than victory. It needed meaning. In the old cities of Mesopotamia, where divine ownership structured imagination, no ruler could simply claim the city as his private possession without speaking the language of service. He became the shepherd of the people, the builder of temples, the restorer of canals, the provider of offerings, the judge beneath divine order, the warrior who defended the gods' land. This was a profound transformation. The gods did not disappear as kings became stronger. Instead, kings moved closer to the gods in public language. They repaired sanctuaries. They dedicated vessels. They placed inscriptions in sacred spaces. They claimed that divine command had guided their hands. They presented military success as the will of heaven. They described their rule not as personal appetite, but as cosmic duty. The city still belonged to the god, but the king increasingly became the god's most powerful servant. That service could be beautiful. A ruler might clear canals, restore irrigation, rebuild walls, sponsor festivals, protect trade, and order justice. In a fragile landscape, good government mattered. People needed water to reach fields. They needed roads and channels maintained. They needed disputes settled before quarrels became bloodshed. They needed defense against raiders and rival cities. The king could embody stability in an unstable world. To praise him as divinely guided was not always empty flattery. It could express the hope that power might serve order. Yet service could also become domination. The same sacred language that called the king a shepherd could hide the stick in his hand. The same inscriptions that celebrated temple building did not preserve the voices of those who carried the bricks. The same royal claim to justice could silence those judged by royal officials. Sacred kingship gave political power a brilliance difficult to challenge. To oppose the ruler could appear not merely rebellious, but impious. When authority borrows the voice of heaven, human disagreement becomes dangerous. This is how gods became kings, and kings became almost godlike. Not always literally, and not in the same way in every city or period, but through a gradual tightening of imagination. The divine world remained above, yet the king stood at its earthly threshold. He could claim special favour. He could wear signs of sacred office. He could enter spaces forbidden to ordinary people. He could build monuments that made his name part of ritual memory. He could use writing to stretch his presence beyond his body, across regions, across generations, across the dead silence of future ruins. Royal inscriptions are acts of survival. They speak to gods, to subjects, to rivals, and to unborn readers. They say, I built, I conquered, I restored, I was chosen, I made the city prosper. They carve a ruler's image into the sacred order so that his name might not vanish like breath in the desert wind. In a world where most people left no written names, the king's name was repeated, copied, buried in foundations, and placed before divine eyes. The king learned to inhabit time differently from ordinary people. A farmer lived by seasons, a potter by production, a shepherd by the movement of flocks, a scribe by tablets and archives. But the king sought historical memory. He wanted the future to know him. He wanted later rulers to see his works and honour them or fear them. He wanted the gods to remember his gifts. He wanted his city to become a theatre of his legitimacy. Through temples, walls, canals, stelae, and tablets, kingship became a craft of memory. Warfare strengthened this process, as cities competed for land, water, trade routes, and prestige. Military leadership became increasingly important. A city that could not defend its fields might lose not only wealth, but divine honour. Defeat could mean tribute, destruction, humiliation, or the carrying away of sacred images. Victory could be described as the triumph of one city's god over another's. The king became the war leader, whose violence could be sanctified as protection. This was a dangerous idea. Once war is wrapped in sacred language, killing can be transformed into obedience. The enemy is not only a rival community, he becomes the opponent of divine order. His defeat becomes a ritual fact, not only a political one. Ancient inscriptions could present conquest with chilling confidence, as though the crushed bodies of enemies were proof of cosmic justice. The king stood over the fallen and claimed that heaven had willed it. Yet even here, one must resist simple judgment. The people of Sumer lived in a world where survival was uncertain and threat was real. Cities did raid one another, fields could be seized, canals could be cut. Walls mattered because enemies existed. A strong ruler may have been feared, but he may also have been desired by those who wanted protection. The rise of kingship was not merely the theft of power from the people. It was also a response to the pressures of a crowded, competitive, or dangerous world. Still, the transformation left deep marks. Earlier collective forms of authority faded behind the bright image of the ruler. The names of kings became anchors of chronology. The deeds of kings shaped official memory. The temple remained central, but the palace grew louder. Administrators served institutions increasingly tied to royal command. Armies became more organized. Tribute flowed. Monumental art displayed rulers larger than other men, physically elevated, ritually distinct, visually dominant. The human body of the king became symbolic territory. His posture, clothing, beard, weapons, and gestures all communicated order. He might be shown worshipping before a god, proving humility. He might be shown smiting enemies, proving strength. He might carry a basket in a foundation ritual, proving his role as temple builder. He might stand in formal stillness, proving dignity. The image taught subjects how power wished to be seen. The king's body also carried burdens. If he claimed divine favour, failure became dangerous. A drought, a defeat, a plague, a rebellion, or a ruined harvest could stain his legitimacy. The ruler who stood closest to heaven also stood closest to blame. He had to maintain the god's favour, or at least maintain the appearance of favour. He had to sponsor rituals, restore buildings, protect fields, and project confidence. Kingship was not simply privilege, it was performance under sacred pressure. The royal court became a new centre of gravity. Around the king gathered officials, scribes, guards, messengers, artisans, musicians, wives, servants, counsellors, and soldiers. The palace organised resources differently from the temple, though the two were often intertwined. Palace power could direct labour, collect tribute, manage land, and command armies. It created opportunities for loyal service and new hierarchies of dependence. It also created rivalries, intrigues, and the constant anxiety of succession. Who would rule when the king died? This question haunted all hereditary power. A city might survive a flood or a siege, but a broken succession could tear it from within. Brothers, sons, generals, priestly factions, and city elites might struggle over the future. The king's divine favour did not always pass smoothly to the next body. Ritual could proclaim continuity, but ambition could disrupt it. Sacred kingship promised order, yet dynasties were made of mortal flesh. This is the tragedy at the heart of the Sumerian royal idea. The king reaches toward eternity, but he dies. He places his name in temples, but the walls decay. He claims divine command, but future kings overwrite his memory. He builds canals, but rivers shift. He defeats enemies, but new enemies arise. He feeds the gods, but one day other hands must continue the offerings. The crown shines for a moment against the vast darkness of time, and yet the idea endured. Kingship became one of the most powerful inventions of the ancient Near East. Not because it was merely force, but because it joined force to story. It told people why one man could command many. It placed administration within cosmic order. It made temple building a royal duty. It made war a sacred drama. It made justice a divine responsibility. It turned the ruler into a living bridge between heaven's command and the city's obedience. The Sumerian texts preserve this transformation in fragments, titles, hymns, king lists, inscriptions, and myths. They show a world trying to understand how human authority should sit beneath divine authority. They reveal admiration, anxiety, propaganda, hope, and fear. They tell us that kingship descended from heaven, but archaeology shows that it also rose from earth, from the needs of irrigation, defense, surplus, competition, and control. Both truths mattered to Sumer. The king was made of clay, breath, blood, and ambition, but when he stood before the god, when scribes pressed his name into tablets, when workers raised his temple foundations, when soldiers marched beneath his command, he became something more than a man in the political imagination of the city. He became the mortal face of sacred order. War among the holy cities of Sumer was not merely the collision of men with spears, it was the collision of worlds. Each city carried its own divine patron, its own sacred landscape, its own fields, canals, boundaries, ancestors, festivals, and memories of favour. To attack a rival was never only to seize land. It was to challenge the order that rival city claimed to embody. It was to test whose god had strength, whose ruler had legitimacy, whose walls would stand, whose fields would feed the next generation, and whose name would be remembered when scribes pressed the account of victory into clay. The flat land of southern Mesopotamia encouraged conflict as much as cooperation. There were no high mountain barriers separating one city from another. The cultivated zones spread along waterways, and water was life. Control of a canal could mean control of harvests. A boundary stone could mean food for one community and hunger for another. Silt, flood, and shifting river branches could alter the landscape, but human claims remained fierce. When fields overlapped, when irrigation channels were disputed, when one city accused another of encroachment, the sacred language of order could quickly become the sacred language of war. The quarrel between neighbouring cities was often a quarrel over the earth itself. Soil was not abstract property. It was barley, beer, bread, animals, rations, offerings, wages, dowries, taxes, and survival. A field lost to an enemy was not a number in a ledger alone. It was a family's labour redirected, a temple's income reduced, a ruler's prestige weakened, a god's estate diminished. The stakes were immediate and cosmic at once. Men might march under banners, but beneath the banners lay canals, harvests, and hunger. Ancient inscriptions do not give us war as the defeated experienced it. They give us war through the mouths of victors. The victorious ruler speaks with certainty. He says that his god delivered the enemy into his hand. He says that he restored justice, corrected a boundary, punished arrogance, or fulfilled a divine command. He lists conquered towns. He names defeated rulers. He measures what he seized. He sets up a monument so that his version of events stands in stone, clay, or memory. The dead do not answer. The burned houses do not speak. The weeping families appear only as shadows behind the formal language of triumph. This is why war records must be read with caution. A royal inscription is not neutral. It is a weapon made of words. It continues the battle after the spears have been lowered. It arranges memory so that the victor's violence becomes order and the enemy's resistance becomes rebellion, arrogance, or sin. Yet even propaganda preserves truth of a kind. It shows what rulers wanted others to believe. It reveals the sacred logic used to justify conflict. It tells us that war needed more than force. It needed a story. In Sumer, that story often began with divine ownership. If a god owned a city and its lands, then an attack on those lands became an offence against the god. A ruler who defended them could present himself as pious and necessary. If another city seized fields, blocked canals, or refused restitution, the conflict could be framed as the restoration of divine justice. War was turned into an act of repair. Violence became the means by which a broken order was forced back into place. But every city could tell its own sacred story. The enemy also had a god. The enemy also had ancestors, priests, workers, and children. The enemy also believed itself woven into divine order. This is the tragic grandeur of the Sumerian world. Its wars were not fought between belief and unbelief, but between rival sacred systems. Each side could imagine heaven leaning toward its own walls. Each side could pray before marching. Each side could believe that victory would prove the truth of divine favour. On the battlefield, such thoughts met dust, fear, and bronze. War in early Mesopotamia was bodily and close. Men carried spears, axes, daggers, shields, and bows, chariots or battle carts, drawn by equids, appear in ancient art as vehicles of elite display and military movement. Helmets and protective garments marked those who could obtain them. Formations mattered, discipline mattered, noise mattered. The advance of soldiers across a dry plain would have raised dust that stuck to sweat and entered the mouth. Animals strained in harness. Commanders shouted, metal flashed, yes, the smell of leather, dung, blood, and sun-heated bodies filled the air. The heroic image of war hides terror. A spear wound is not symbolic to the man who receives it. A shattered skull is not theology to the mother who hears of it. A city taken by force does not experience conquest as a carved scene of royal glory. It experiences broken doors, lost grain, violated sanctuaries, smoke, captives, and the terrible uncertainty of who will return. The sacred banners of war did not soften the grief of the defeated. They may have made the grief harder, because defeat suggested divine withdrawal. When a city fell, its god could be taken. The removal of a divine statue was among the most devastating acts imaginable. To modern eyes, it may seem like the seizure of an object. To the ancient city, it meant the abduction of presence. The god's earthly body had left the sanctuary. The rituals could no longer proceed in the proper way. The city's protection was broken. Its identity was wounded at the deepest level. A conquered people might hope for the god's return as much as for political restoration. This is why temple destruction carried such emotional force. The temple was not a warehouse accidentally damaged in war. It was the house of the divine owner. To loot it was to dishonor the god. To burn or desecrate it was to interrupt the relation between heaven and earth. Yet conquerors also feared the gods they attacked. A ruler might destroy a rival city and still present offerings to the wider divine order. He might claim that the enemy's own god had permitted punishment. He might avoid saying that he had defeated the god directly, preferring the safer language of divine judgment. War required theological diplomacy. No ruler wished to appear as an enemy of the gods in general. He wished to appear as the agent of the proper gods against improper humans. This distinction allowed conquest to be justified without undermining the sacred fabric shared across the region. The defeated city had not proven that gods were powerless. It had proven that its ruler, its people, or its destiny had fallen under judgment. Such interpretations protected the worldview even as cities burned. Material evidence adds another voice to the story. Broken fortifications, weapon finds, destruction layers, mass graves, trauma on bones, hurried repairs, and changes in settlement patterns can reveal conflict without royal boasting. Archaeology does not flatter the victor. It shows collapse, burning, abandonment, rebuilding, and sometimes the intimate violence done to bodies. Lithic analysis and metallurgical study can identify tools and weapons, while stratigraphic excavation places destruction within sequences of occupation. These scientific methods do not remove the drama. They bring it closer. A burned layer is the ash of a human day. A wall rebuilt in haste may speak of fear. A buried weapon may suggest a moment of danger or ritual disposal. A skeleton with trauma may hold the last violence of a life. A sudden change in pottery or administration may suggest conquest, migration, or political restructuring. Each clue is partial. Each must be treated carefully. But together they remind us that ancient warfare was not only carved in monuments, it entered floors, bones, streets, and silence. The armies of Sumer were not separate from society. Soldiers came from communities that also farmed, built, worshipped, and laboured. War drew upon the same administrative systems that managed temples and fields. Men had to be summoned, equipped, fed, and directed. Campaigns required logistics. Weapons required specialists. Supplies required records. The city that could count grain could feed an army. The institution that could command canal labour could also command military labour. Administration and warfare grew together. Professional soldiers may have emerged alongside older forms of levy service. As conflict became more regular and rulers more powerful, military specialization gained importance. The warrior elite could rise in status. Palace institutions could maintain retainers. Royal households could reward loyalty with land, goods, or prestige. Violence became a path to advancement, and advancement strengthened the ruler who controlled it. Thus, war helped create the very kingship that then justified war. The circle was hard to break. Rivalry produced armies. Armies empowered kings. Kings pursued prestige. Prestige required victories. Victories demanded inscriptions, monuments, and offerings. The gods were invoked at every turn. The holy city became a war city when its survival, pride, and resources were threatened. Sacred identity did not prevent violence. It gave violence a language. Yet war also produced unity. A city under threat could gather around its god, its ruler, and its walls. Fear can bind people as tightly as devotion. The festival procession and the military muster may seem opposite, but both teach collective identity. In one, the people move together in reverence. In the other, they move together in defense or aggression. Both say, "We are this city, not that one. We belong to this god, this land, this memory." The boundary between sacred celebration and martial display could blur. Banners, music, formal movement, elite costumes, weapons, animals, and public gathering all belong to the theatre of power. A ruler returning from victory might bring captives, booty, and divine offerings into the city. Turning war into spectacle, the people saw proof that their god had prevailed. The temple received gifts. The king's name grew larger. The defeated were made visible as evidence of order restored. But beneath the spectacle lay grief travelling in the opposite direction. Somewhere another city counted its dead. Somewhere a mother waited for a son who would not come back. Somewhere a priest entered a damaged sanctuary. Somewhere fields lay unworked, because the men who should have tended them were gone or captured. Somewhere children learned a new ruler's name. The triumph of one city was the wound of another. The Sumerian world was brilliant, sacred, and violent. Its people built temples, wrote hymns, measured fields, studied signs, and imagined the gods dwelling among them. They also fought over land, water, honour, and authority. These facts do not cancel each other. They belong together. Civilization did not arrive as peace. It arrived with administration, hierarchy, devotion, beauty, coercion, and war braided into one difficult fabric. Or among the holy cities reveals the double edge of sacred order. When people believe a place is holy, they will preserve it with astonishing love. They may also defend it with terrible force. The god city inspires devotion, but devotion can harden into rivalry. A temple gives meaning to labour, but it can also become a banner over soldiers. A ruler claims to restore justice, but justice may arrive as fire. Still, the ruins ask for more than condemnation. They ask for understanding. They ask us to see ancient people not as simple brutes or innocent dreamers, but as our equals in complexity. They loved their cities. They feared their enemies. They trusted their gods. They desired security, food, honour, continuity, and the survival of their names. In the heat of the alluvial plain, beneath skies that offered no shelter from history, they fought because the world they built was precious and precarious. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made beneath the mounds of Sumer. A sealed archive may yet reveal a defeated city's voice. A damaged inscription may alter the map of an old campaign. A grave may hold evidence of a forgotten battle. A canal bed may explain a war once remembered as divine anger. Until then, the story remains fragmentary, fierce, and answerless, adrift to ponder. The holy cities raised temples to heaven. Then they marched against one another beneath the names of gods. The ziggurats did not collapse in a single night. No one moment ended the sacred world of Sumer. No single flood, no single army, no single drought, no single failed harvest can explain the slow weakening of a civilization that had been built from water, clay, memory, labour, and divine command. The fall of the old cities was not a clean event. It was a long pressure, a tightening, a sequence of strains gathering across generations until the world that once seemed ordained by heaven became vulnerable to forces from within and beyond its walls. Civilizations often appear strongest just before their fragility becomes visible. A temple still receives offerings, a king still issues commands, a scribe still presses signs into clay, the canal still carries water, the wall still stands. The people still rise in the morning and go to their work, yet beneath the surface, fields may be weakening, rivalry sharpening, borders trembling, and old certainties losing their force. Collapse does not always begin with flames. Sometimes it begins with smaller harvests, unpaid obligations, restless labourers, anxious priests, overextended rulers, and salt gathering silently in the soil. The earth itself was one of Sumer's great adversaries. Irrigation made abundance possible. But in the heat of southern Mesopotamia it could also damage the land across time. Water drawn into fields leaves traces behind. As it evaporates under the fierce sun, salts can rise toward the surface. At first the change may be slight, almost invisible. Then yields decline, crops struggle. The soil grows pale and bitter. Farmers may shift to hardier grains. Administrators may record the change without understanding the full depth of the danger. A civilization built on barley can endure many shocks, but it cannot ignore the field forever. The land remembers every mistake. A canal poorly maintained can silt up. A drainage system neglected can poison the future. A ruler seeking immediate wealth may demand too much from fields that need rest. A temple requiring offerings may not reduce its appetite simply because the countryside is tired. Cities are hungry organisms. They consume grain, animals, timber, labour, cloth, oil, and loyalty. The larger they become, the more they depend on systems beyond the sight of those who live near the sacred centre. When those systems strain, the city's grandeur becomes a burden. The ziggurat rises above the plain, but its foundation is the field. If the field weakens, the tower is already in danger. Environmental stress did not act alone. It joined with politics. The Sumerian cities had long competed with one another, and competition could exhaust them. War damaged canals, seized labour, consumed grain, and created captives and refugees. Rival rulers glorified victory, but the cost of conflict moved through households. A campaign celebrated in an inscription might mean empty storehouses elsewhere. A boundary dispute might leave irrigation works ruined. A defeated city might struggle for years to restore ordinary life. Power itself could become unstable. Kingship promised order, but kings died. Dynasties failed. Sons fought brothers. Local elites resisted central command. Priests defended privileges. Governors turned ambitious. Foreign powers watched for weakness. A city-state world could produce brilliance, but it could also produce fragmentation. When unity was needed, rivalry often returned. When stability was proclaimed, succession could open wounds. The sacred language of kingship could not prevent mortal politics from decaying into conflict. Then came outsiders, though outsiders is too simple a word. The history of Mesopotamia was never sealed. Peoples moved, traded, served, settled, intermarried, fought, and ruled across the plains and highlands. Semitic-speaking groups had long been part of the wider world of southern Mesopotamia. Elamites, Amorites, Gutians, Akkadians, and others appear in the shifting record of power. These were not shadowy invaders from a fantasy frontier. They were human communities with their own ambitions, needs, leaders, gods, and strategies. Some entered as merchants or labourers, some as soldiers, some as rulers, some as conquerors. Sumer's fall was therefore also a transformation. The language of Sumerian gradually ceased to be the everyday speech of the people, but it did not vanish. It became a language of scholarship, ritual, prestige, and memory. Cities changed hands, dynasties rose under new names, gods were identified, reinterpreted, honoured, or absorbed into broader pantheons. Old temples were restored by rulers who were not Sumerian in speech, but desired the authority of Sumerian sacred tradition. The civilization did not simply die, it passed into others, like a river entering canals. Yet there were violent breaks. Cities were sacked, temples were looted, statues were carried away, archives were scattered or buried, walls fell, workers were displaced. The laments for destroyed cities preserve an atmosphere of unbearable loss. They speak as though the city itself has become a widow, as though the streets have lost their children, as though the god has withdrawn and left the sanctuary cold. These compositions are literary, theological, and political, but their emotional truth is fierce. They show that urban collapse was felt not merely as economic hardship, but as cosmic abandonment. To see a ziggurat damaged was to see the world wounded vertically. The temple tower connected realms in imagination. Its ruin suggested that the link between heaven and earth had been broken. Bricks scattered at its base were not only construction debris, they were the fallen flesh of sacred order. A city whose temple no longer functioned properly was a body without a beating heart. Markets might continue, families might survive, but the city's identity had been pierced. The people of Sumer were not passive before decline. They repaired, rebuilt, reorganized, appealed to gods, changed crops, shifted alliances, accepted new rulers, resisted enemies, copied old texts, taught scribes, re-established rituals. Human beings rarely experience collapse as a neat historical category. They experience it as daily problem-solving. A broken wall must be patched. A missing ration must be replaced. A dead father must be mourned. A new authority must be obeyed or challenged. A damaged shrine must be cleansed. Life continues even when the world is ending. This is why collapse can be so difficult to recognize from within. The sacred calendar still turns. Children are born. Bread is baked. Marriages are arranged. Debts are remembered. A festival may still fill the streets with music. The old hymns may still be sung, even if the city is poorer than it was. Decline does not cancel life. It changes its weight. People live under greater anxiety, reduced certainty, and thicker memories of loss. They compare the present to a golden past, whether that past was ever truly golden or not. The scribes helped preserve that golden past. By copying ancient compositions, they kept the names of Sumer alive after political power had shifted. They maintained a scholarly world in which old kings, old gods, old cities, and old myths remained meaningful. The tablet became a refuge against disappearance. In a changing world, writing could insist that what had been sacred remained sacred. A city might fall, but its name could still be copied by a student centuries later. A god's temple might lie in ruin, but the hymn could still describe it as radiant. There is a melancholy grandeur in this. Sumerian civilization became most immortal when it was no longer fully alive in its earliest form. Its language survived as learning. Its myths survived through translation and adaptation. Its gods survived under new relationships. Its urban forms influenced later Mesopotamian kingdoms. Its idea of the sacred city continued to shape political imagination. The physical cities weakened, but their intellectual and ritual inheritance travelled onward. Still, the cost was real. The old local worlds lost their independence. Sacred identities were folded into larger kingdoms and empires. The autonomy of city gods had to coexist with broader imperial pantheons. The palace increasingly overshadowed many older communal structures. Professional armies and royal bureaucracies expanded the scale of command. The intimate god city of early Sumer gave way to more centralized systems of rule. Something was gained in scale and durability. Something was lost in local immediacy. The collapse beneath the ziggurats was not only destruction, it was the end of a way of imagining the city as the primary sacred unit of the world. Later powers still revered ancient cities, but empire changes the meaning of holiness. The god no longer belongs only to one city's horizon. The king rules many cities. Tribute flows across greater distances. Official memory becomes broader, heavier, more political. The sacred landscape is reorganized around imperial ambition. The ziggurat remains, but the world around it has changed. Its bricks still rise from older foundations. Its terraces still catch the sun. Its name still carries divine force. Yet the people passing beneath it may speak another language. The ruler restoring it may come from another lineage. The scribes praising it may be preserving an ancient tradition rather than describing a living urban order in its first intensity. The building continues, but its meaning shifts. This is how civilizations haunt the ages. They do not disappear completely. They become layers, a temple beneath a temple, a myth beneath a myth. a dead language inside a scholar's exercise, a ruined city under a later settlement, a god renamed but not forgotten, a flood story reshaped by new readers, a king list copied by hands that never saw the old kingdom. Collapse is not only an end, it is a burial, and burial can preserve. Beneath the ziggurats, the evidence waits in broken forms, a charred beam, a fallen wall, a tablet sealed by fire, a drain clogged with silt, a pottery change in a destruction layer, a foundation inscription placed by a hopeful ruler who believed restoration would hold. Scientific methods help order these traces. Stratigraphic excavation shows sequence. Radiocarbon dating refines time. Environmental studies reveal stress in water and soil. Genomic data may illuminate movements of people across the wider region. Yet the deepest question remains human. What does a people feel when the gods no longer seem to protect the city? The answer is written in lament. It is written in the image of empty streets, scattered people, silent temples, and the bitter cry that the city has been abandoned. It is written in rebuilding as much as mourning. To rebuild a temple after catastrophe is to refuse the finality of loss. To copy a hymn after conquest is to deny that memory can be conquered. To place offerings again before a restored image is to say that the relationship between heaven and earth can be repaired. The old cities of Sumer passed through decline, conquest, absorption, and transformation. Their independence faded, their speech changed, their gods entered wider worlds, their towers weathered under sun and wind. But the collapse did not erase the astonishing fact of what had been created there. On a difficult plain of rivers, salt, mud, and heat, human beings had built sacred cities that taught later ages how to imagine writing. Kingship, temple, law, memory, and cosmic order. The ziggurats stand in ruin now, but ruin is not emptiness. Ruin is the form endurance takes when glory has been stripped of its voice. The temples fell silent, but the tablets continued to speak. This is one of the strangest forms of survival in human history. A city can lose its walls, a shrine can lose its image, a dynasty can lose its throne, a language can lose the mouths that once carried it through markets, courtyards, fields, and festivals. Yet a clay tablet, small enough to rest in a hand, can endure beneath rubble, while centuries pass above it like wind over a buried grave. The Sumerians built with mud, and mud returned to mud. But clay, once shaped, marked, dried, and sometimes fired by disaster, could resist oblivion. The tablets outlived the roofs that sheltered them. They outlived the shelves that held them. They outlived the scribes who copied them, the priests who recited them, the rulers who commissioned them, and the workers whose rations they recorded. They survived not because they were grand, but because they were humble. Gold attracts thieves. Wood burns. Cloth rots. Stone can be broken and reused. Clay, once abandoned in the earth, may wait with almost infinite patience. In this way, Sumer's greatest monument was not only the ziggurat, it was the archive. A ziggurat lifts itself toward heaven, commanding the eye from a distance. An archive hides in rooms, baskets, jars, corners, and broken floors. It does not dominate the skyline, it waits in darkness. Yet within those tablets lived the machinery of civilization. There were lists of labourers, offerings to gods, legal agreements, letters, hymns, myths, school exercises, royal inscriptions, mathematical texts, and laments for ruined cities. In the archive, the sacred city became portable. Its words could travel farther than its walls. The survival of Sumerian writing created a peculiar afterlife. Even as everyday speech shifted, Sumerian remained powerful as a learned language. It became a language of temples, scholarship, ritual, and prestige. Students in later Mesopotamian schools copied old Sumerian words beside Akkadian equivalents. They learned signs that belonged to a past already ancient to them. They preserved compositions whose first singers were gone beyond recovery. In their classrooms, Sumer did not vanish. It became tradition. This is a different kind of immortality. It is not the immortality of an unbroken kingdom. It is the immortality of study. A civilization becomes sacred curriculum. Its words are repeated by students who may stumble, complain, miscopy, and try again. Its gods are named in lists. Its myths are copied as exercises. Its hymns become models of learned refinement. Its grammar becomes difficult, respected, and remote. The living city becomes a school text, and through that transformation, it survives. There is something tender in this. A young scribe, sitting in a room thick with dust and discipline, copies a line older than his own world. Perhaps he does not fully feel the vanished city behind the signs. Perhaps he's anxious about correction. Perhaps his teacher is impatient. Perhaps the heat is oppressive. Yet his hand becomes an instrument of preservation. Without such students, without such ordinary acts of copying, much of Sumerian memory would have vanished completely. The tablets also carried Sumer into other languages. Stories changed as they travelled. Divine names shifted. Myths were translated, expanded, rearranged, and reinterpreted. The old Sumerian imagination entered Akkadian literature, Babylonian scholarship, Assyrian libraries, and the wider intellectual world of the ancient Near East. What began in the cities of southern Mesopotamia did not remain confined to them. It flowed outward like river water, through channels cut by scribes. A story never survives unchanged. When a myth is copied in another time, it takes on new breath. A god may gain new titles. A city may become a memory rather than a living centre. A king may turn from historical figure into legend. A flood account may be reshaped by later theology. A lament may become a model for mourning in circumstances its first composer never imagined. Tradition is not a museum case. It is a living river, and every generation that drinks from it changes its course. The Sumerian flood traditions are among the most powerful examples of this movement. The idea of an overwhelming flood, of chosen survival, of divine decision, of the destruction and renewal of human society, travelled through Mesopotamian literature in forms that would echo far beyond Sumer. Later, peoples gave the story their own meanings. They placed it within their own understanding of gods, justice, humanity, and creation. The Sumerian memory did not remain itself alone. It became part of a much larger human meditation on catastrophe. The same happened with kingship. The idea that royal authority descended from heaven did not die with the old city-states. It entered the political imagination of later kingdoms. Rulers continued to present themselves as chosen, beloved, commanded, or approved by the divine. They built temples, restored old sanctuaries, claimed justice, and used sacred language to make power appear necessary. The old Sumerian city may have weakened, but its vision of sacred authority endured in forms both magnificent and dangerous. The gods also travelled. Some remained tied to ancient cult centres. Some were absorbed into wider pantheons. Some changed names or relationships as Semitic-speaking communities. Imperial powers and local traditions interacted across centuries. Divine families were reorganized. Myths were woven together. A god once rooted in one city could become part of a larger theological system. The sacred geography of Sumer became a memory map inside later Mesopotamian religion. Writing made this possible. Without writing, tradition depends upon the breath of living reciters. That kind of memory can be strong, beautiful, and flexible, but it is vulnerable to interruption. Writing does not replace oral memory, but it gives memory another body. A tablet can sleep while empires rise and fall. It can be forgotten, buried, and rediscovered. It can carry a voice across a silence no human lineage could bridge by speech alone. Yet writing also freezes what was once fluid. A hymn written down may look final, but it may preserve only one version among many. A myth on clay may seem authoritative, but other tellings may have lived and died without leaving marks. The archive is a miracle, but it is also selective. It preserves what institutions valued, what scribes copied, what accidents spared, and what excavators later recovered. The tablets outlive the temples, but they do not tell everything. They rarely speak with the full voice of the poor. They rarely tell us the private thoughts of women grinding grain at dawn. They rarely preserve the jokes of workers, the lullabies of mothers, the resentments of servants, the doubts of young priests, or the whispered fears of soldiers before battle. They give us immense knowledge, but not total knowledge. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. This silence must be honoured. The tablets are not the whole past. They are the surviving edge of a vast human darkness. For every line preserved, countless words vanished in the air. For every archive found, others remain buried or destroyed. For every named king, thousands lived nameless beneath the same sun. The written past is brilliant, but it shines over an ocean of the unwritten. And yet, what survives is enough to astonish. Because of the tablets, we know that the people of Sumer did not simply build and vanish. They thought deeply about origin, power, death, labour, justice, sex, war, flood, grief, and the gods. They asked why cities fall. They praised wisdom. They feared chaos. They organised the world into lists. They studied language. They trained scribes. They measured fields. They imagined divine assemblies. They mourned destruction with poetic force. Their intellectual world was not small. It stretched from the grain ration to the cosmic decree, from a schoolboy's exercise to the fate of kingship, from a temple account to the sorrow of a ruined city. This range is what makes Sumer so enduringly human. The civilization that counted sheep also contemplated eternity. The people who repaired canals also asked why the gods had made human beings. The scribes who recorded jars of beer also preserved stories that would echo across continents and millennia. The tablets travelled again in the modern age. They entered museums, universities, private collections, excavation reports, digital databases, and scholarly debates. Some were carefully excavated, some were removed in times when archaeological practice was far less disciplined. Some were broken by looting, war, neglect, or mishandling. Their modern journey is not always noble. It is tangled with empire, collecting, scholarship, greed, rescue, damage, and devotion. Even their survival in the present carries moral questions. A tablet is not only an object of study, it is a displaced fragment of a vanished world. To read it well requires more than cleverness. It requires humility. The signs may be small, but they stand at the meeting point of archaeology, language, history, and human longing. A translator leaning over a tablet is not merely solving a puzzle. That translator is touching a voice that crossed the grave of civilization itself. This is why the tablets matter more than legend. They discipline imagination. They prevent us from turning Sumer into pure fantasy. They show us actual institutions, actual names, actual transactions, actual prayers. They anchor mystery and evidence. At the same time, they deepen mystery, because the more we know, the more complex the world becomes. Every translated line opens new questions. Every archive reveals another system of labour, belief, or memory. Every answer leads into another sealed room. The temples fell silent, but their language endured in clay. The gods lost their offering, but their hymns survived. The kings lost their bodies, but their names remained pressed into signs. The workers lost their voices, but their rations remained recorded. The cities lost their streets, but their identities travelled through tablets into later ages. This is the secret afterlife of Sumer, not resurrection in flesh, not uninterrupted power, not the return of the old gods to their houses, but memory preserved in the most earthly substance imaginable. River mud became the vessel of eternity. Clay, taken from the banks of mortal water, carried the thoughts of a civilization beyond the collapse of its temples, and somewhere, in the quiet of a museum drawer or the darkness beneath an unexcavated mound, a tablet still waits, small, silent, untranslated, holding a city inside it. What remains of the god cities is not what their builders hoped would remain. The songs no longer rise at dawn from the temple courts. The divine meals are no longer prepared in bowls and jars. The processions no longer move through streets crowded with dust, incense, and watching faces. The sacred images no longer sit enthroned in dark chambers while priests approach with bread, beer, oil, and whispered words. The canals have shifted. The fields have changed. The walls have slumped into mounds. The voices of Sumer have passed into clay, scholarship, and silence. Yet the cities remain, not as living cities in the old sense, not as places where the gods still receive their daily offerings, but as questions. Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, Kish, Shuruppak. Their names are not merely archaeological labels, they are doorways into the first great human attempt to organize society around sacred order, written memory, monumental building, institutional labor, and cosmic meaning. They remind us that civilization was never only a practical arrangement, it was also a dream about where human beings stood in the universe. The Sumerians built their cities as if the world had a hidden structure. They believed that power descended, that destinies could be decreed, that gods might choose places, that ritual could maintain order, that bricks could house divinity, that writing could preserve truth, that kingship required heavenly sanction, and that disaster might signal the withdrawal of divine favour. To modern minds, some of these ideas may feel distant, yet the need beneath them is familiar. Human beings still search for order. We still build institutions larger than ourselves. We still mark sacred spaces. We still attach memory to stone, paper, screens, monuments, and graves. We still ask why cities rise, why they fall, and whether meaning survives ruin. The Sumerian answer was written in mud, brick, and clay. A city was not merely a shelter. It was a relationship between people and land, between labour and authority, between water and survival, between memory and power, between mortals and gods. Every wall, canal, tablet, field, and sanctuary belonged to this web. Nothing important stood alone. The city was a woven thing, and when one strand weakened, the whole fabric felt the strain. This is why Sumer's ruins are so moving. They do not show us a simple beginning, clean and innocent. They show us complexity from the start. The first cities were already filled with beauty and inequality, devotion and control, wisdom and ambition, cooperation and violence. They were already human. There is no lost age where civilization was pure. There is only the long, difficult record of people trying to create order while carrying fear, hunger, hope, pride, love, and longing within them. The people of Sumer were not children at the dawn of history. They were our intellectual equals, facing problems that still haunt the world. How should labour be organised? Who may command? What makes power legitimate? How should wealth be stored and distributed? What do communities owe the sacred, the dead, the poor, the ruler, the future? What happens when the environment that nourishes a society begins to fail? How does a city remember itself after catastrophe? What language can grief use when ordinary explanation is not enough? Their answers were not ours, but their questions are still alive. They answered with gods, temples, scribes, offerings, kings, laments, and lists. They answered with buildings that rose from the plain like artificial mountains. They answered with tablets that turned breath into durable marks. They answered with myths of flood and divine descent. They answered with ceremonies that made the city feel like the centre of creation. They answered with walls, armies, and royal inscriptions. They answered with mourning when those answers failed. The most haunting lesson of Sumer is that civilization is maintenance. Nothing holds by itself. Fields must be watered, but not ruined. Canals must be cleared. Temples must be repaired. Laws must be remembered. Children must be taught. Food must be stored. Conflicts must be contained. Stories must be retold. The gods of Sumer required daily service, and in that requirement we see a larger truth. Every human order, sacred or secular, survives through repeated acts of care. When care stops, collapse begins quietly. A city can fall long before its walls come down. It can fall when its soil is exhausted. It can fall when trust decays. It can fall when rulers take more than they restore. It can fall when institutions serve only themselves. It can fall when memory becomes propaganda and justice becomes display. It can fall when people no longer believe that the centre can hold. The ziggurat may still stand in the sunlight, but the invisible architecture may already be breaking. The Sumerians knew this fear. Their laments for ruined cities are among the most powerful cries of the ancient world because they understand destruction as more than damage. A ruined city is a broken relationship between earth, heaven, and community. The empty street is not just empty. It is a sign that meaning has fled. The silent temple is not just a building without sound. It is a wound in the order of things. The abandoned house is not only shelter lost, it is a memory without a body. Yet Sumer also teaches that memory can outlive devastation. The tablets survived, the myths travelled, the old language endured in schools and rituals, the sacred ideas of kingship, temple, law, lamentation, and cosmic order passed into later Mesopotamian cultures and beyond. The first cities did not keep their original form, but they entered the bloodstream of history. Their influence moved quietly through scribes, conquerors, scholars, priests, storytellers, and readers who never saw the Euphrates plain. This is one of history's deepest paradoxes. A civilization may become most powerful after it has changed beyond recognition. Sumer ceased to exist as a living political world in the way its earliest builders knew it. Yet its inventions continued to shape humanity. Writing, urban administration, temple economies, royal ideology, legal memory, literary tradition, mathematical thinking, sacred kingship, and the idea of the city as a cosmic centre all found later forms. The gods' houses fell, but the habits formed around them endured. In this sense, the god cities were not failures. They were beginnings. They were experiments conducted under difficult skies, beside unpredictable rivers, on land that demanded labour and punished arrogance. Their people did not know they were founding civilization for later ages to study. They were trying to live. They were trying to feed their gods, protect their children, settle disputes, survive floods, command labour, defeat enemies, and keep memory from vanishing. They were improvising beneath the gaze of eternity. The modern archaeologist who kneels in the dust of a Sumerian mound enters that improvisation with different tools. A trowel reveals a wall line. A soil sample preserves traces of environment. Radiocarbon dating narrows the passage of years. Stratigraphic excavation separates one human moment from another. Lithic analysis identifies the making and movement of tools. Genomic data may illuminate population history and human mobility across ancient landscapes. The language of science is precise, careful, and necessary. It protects the past from fantasy. It teaches us to distinguish evidence from desire. But science does not make wonder smaller. It makes wonder more disciplined. The measured layer, the dated seed, the broken tablet, the seal impression, the child's burial, the ash floor, the rebuilt temple foundation, all these things deepen the mystery because they make it real. They show that the ancient world was not a dream floating outside time. It was lived by bodies. It had smells, textures, hunger, illness, laughter, ceremony, fear, and heat. Its gods were served by hands. Its cities were built by backs. Its memory was pressed into clay by fingers that trembled, aged, and died. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. Perhaps another archive waits below a mound not yet opened. Perhaps a damaged tablet, unread in a museum drawer, preserves a hymn to a forgotten shrine. Perhaps environmental evidence will clarify why one city weakened while another endured. Perhaps new methods will reveal patterns of migration, diet, disease, or labour hidden from earlier generations of scholars. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The past is generous, but never complete. That incompleteness is part of its power. If everything were known, the ancient world would become a finished diagram. Instead, it remains a landscape of evidence and shadow. We can trace the walls, translate the signs, date the layers, and reconstruct the systems. But we cannot fully recover the feeling of standing in a Sumerian temple before dawn, hearing water move in the canals, smelling oil smoke in the sanctuary, and believing that a god had chosen the city as his house on earth. We cannot fully know what it meant to fear the flood as divine anger. We cannot fully know what a young scribe felt when his hand first made a sign correctly. We cannot fully know what a labourer thought while carrying bricks for a temple whose beauty would outlive him. We cannot fully know what a mother whispered to a child beneath the shadow of a ziggurat. But we can approach with humility. We can approach through tablets, ruins, excavation, language, and imagination disciplined by evidence. We can stand at the edge of those ancient cities and understand that their people were not distant curiosities. They were human beings making meaning under pressure. They were closer to us than pride allows, and farther from us than easy sympathy can bridge. The secret cities of the ancient gods reveal no simple secret. They reveal a condition. Human beings build because we are fragile. We write because we forget. We worship because the world is vast. We measure because chaos frightens us. We form cities because no one survives alone. We tell stories because disaster without meaning is unbearable. We raise towers because our feet are in mud and our eyes are in the sky. Sumer understood this with terrifying clarity. Its cities were made from River Earth, but they aspired to heaven. Its gods were eternal, but their houses needed repair. Its kings claimed sacred favour, but died like all men. Its scribes preserved memory, but could not preserve everything. Its temples gathered wealth, but could not prevent ruin. Its flood stories warned that the world could end. Yet its archives prove that something can survive the ending. In the end, the god cities remember what every civilization must learn. Nothing we build is permanent in the way we wish it to be, but impermanence does not make building meaningless. The mud brick falls, yet the act of raising it mattered. The song fades, yet the singing mattered. The city dies, yet the memory of the city can guide minds thousands of years away. The gods depart their sanctuaries, yet the human hunger that summoned them remains. So we leave the plain of Sumer in darkness. The rivers move through lands altered by time. The mounds lie under stars that once watched kings, priests, workers, scribes, and children pass through their brief lives. Somewhere beneath the soil, a tablet may still be waiting, its signs pressed by a hand that never imagined us. It may hold an account, a prayer, a name, a lament, a line of myth, or only numbers. Yet even numbers can become sacred when they are all that remains of a vanished world. The ancient gods are silent now, but the cities they inspired still speak, softly, through clay. And if we listen with patience, we may hear not only the beginning of history, but the echo of ourselves.